A Conjuring for Lilith. Was I a bad neighbor? Seeing that I was the corner apartment, I beg your understanding, I never much thought about the people on either side of me, as I only shared my north wall with any living, breathing souls. And I knew from experience that she was hard of hearing, and was known to play her home theater system as loud as she could humanly tolerate. Thus, I never thought it necessary to resist turning up my music to the max, and for good reason indeed, I assure you. Like many of the other hapless radio heads filling their silence with the same four chords on repeat, I bump my freestanding speakers liberally for all to hear, but for the purpose of research. The frequencies and vibrations that press against my four walls, ceilings, and floor are those of a particular order and substance that any layman would find difficult to comprehend as melody or even translate into anything but barnyard raucousness. Surely you must have guessed by now that it isn't music in any real sense of the word, but an eminence that serves a concerted purpose into otherworldly affairs only those schooled in the occult will nod their heads at in knowing recognition. It resembled something like a mix between a didgeridoo crackling in a fire, layered with the death rattle of a smoker's gasp on their last night on earth, fighting for their life. All the while as ear-prickling drums and displaced violins crescendo to a sudden full clatter of domino percussion instruments falling in on each other. If it isn't music, then why play it? Well, it was once music, but the man who sold me this particular record in his oddity shop had recorded it himself from a master tape of a Gregorian chant of the Baroque period. But there shouldn't be anything special about this religious organ music, I hear you say. No, you would be incorrect again, as it was carefully recorded backwards in the same spirit of the rock and roll backmasking of the 1960s, but at 6.6 the speed. I can hear the gears turning in your head now, and I suppose for good reason, but you would have to understand that the record was sold as part of a set. The occult journal accompanying the piece of wax and plastic provides a step-by-step account on the most fundamental method for accomplishing a conjuring. A conjuring of what evil? Would it even be worth my time or yours to insist that it is nothing satanic or demonic? Then I will save my breath and explain that the occult journal is nothing short of a love letter to Lilith, the supreme goddess of creation formed on the same day as Adam and Eve, the wondrous temptress and true wife of the serpent, the mother of the beast and all his brethren. The unnamed man who wrote the journal and provided instructions on recording and playing the record was a true explorer into the other recesses of this world and the next. The keeper of the oddity shop never did express to me the current well-being of such a man of spiritual science, but I feel there would be no need to follow through with such a fact-finding pursuit. No, the journal and record are mine. That is all that matters now. And the shopkeeper only recorded the vinyl so as to complete the set and sweeten the deal. No one but me has the wherewithal to devote himself to an unknown future such as that possessed by your poor, tortured writer, and that is all well and good. Lilith chooses her mates carefully, and I am the one with the strength and will to answer such a call, and she called me by my name. But what completes the set? While the music plays, the listener performs painstakingly the ritual of building his idol, his doll, if you will. The material for the doll must be taken from the earth, but from what material, it doesn't truly matter. The only thing that counts is that the listener builds up the effigy, performs the alchemical marriage with the doll through oil, alcohol, and salt, and then tears it down again. My dolls are strictly fashioned from straw, as I have some experience with basket weaving from my summer camp days in the northeast of America. Every night I build up my Lilith doll, adorn her with 3 parts oil, salt, and alcohol as a gift, and then disassemble her again, all in the divine rite of passage as she passes from the void into this crystallized realm, and then back into her realm of chaos. During those few moments in which we share the same space, she is real, here in my hands, and we are husband and wife. The shopkeeper told me of instances where molds of clay and stone came alive for the sculptors, earth made into flesh, and Lilith was never wont to leave her lover's arms again. In fact, she was known to take them back with her, by the hand, into her realm. Those are his words, of course, and I was 3 months into my endeavor before I was deviating from the instructions in the leather-bound journal, sometimes keeping my effigy for days, dining and sleeping with it, before dismantling it again to begin all over. All with zero success, mind you. It was perhaps to my utmost relief that I stopped playing the record altogether at the request of my landlord, living directly below me, who could no longer stand the haunting, strange overtones reverberating against his ceiling. There were no complaints from the woman living directly above me, however, but the landlord insisted, with much consternation, that she was away for business until the end of the month. Thus, I gratefully acquiesced to his request to stop playing my experimental music, as he was known to call it, and promised that I would find a new place to practice my ritual, though he never knew the full truth of the matter or asked for elaboration. And that was originally my plan, I assure you, as I had hoped that a change of scenery would bring me closer to my love. The journal, in fact, recommended setting a secluded part of the forest as the stage for my shrine to Lilith, and I set my sights on an abandoned encampment I knew just outside of town, where I hoped to continue my practice uninterrupted and far from prying eyes and ears. An apartment was no place for me to dedicate my heart, body, and soul to the fairest Lilith. So I sleeved my unlabeled vinyl and packed up my crafting materials for a weekend trip as soon as my day job would allow. So, the short story long is that, after some 12 weeks of persistent music and craft work indulgences after work from my bar job, I didn't experience a single out-of-sort event, that is, until I was sitting silent and bored in my apartment, all of my senses open and occult paraphernalia pushed away out of sight under my bed. The first sign of strangeness came with a pronounced creak on the floorboards above my head, sometimes deciphered as a peripheral noise, while striding through my own creaky hallway on my way from the bedroom to the bathroom. How could her floor have the same shoddy boards in the same exact spot in the hall? I tell you this because it only took about my 7th trip through the hall that I was sure the groaning was not coming from the boards below me, but from those above. Whenever I stopped, so did the noise. It was only while exercising my own heel and toe in a full-bodied step that I heard it, as if my own weight was causing the walls and ceiling to bend in response. That had been my first thought, but it didn't seem likely, and I was reminded the next day from my landlord that my upstairs neighbor was indeed still out of town. I had never paid too much attention to what her footsteps sounded like above my head, as our schedules never matched up too closely, and I arrived home from work far after she had already gone to bed. Somehow, my instinct told me that what I was hearing was not the result of my own footfalls. No, they became more pronounced the longer I went without the music, and they followed my same path, my usual course through my apartment, from the kitchen to the living room, from the bedroom to the front door. And would you believe me if I told you that I heard the door to my neighbor's house open at the same time as mine? I am shaking now recalling it, but would you also believe that I heard steps in the same stairwell directly above me whenever I proceeded to the first floor? And yes, I know what you're thinking. I always waited outside my apartment building to see if anyone would follow me out, but after 10 minutes, no one ever showed. Whenever I sat down in my worn leather sofa, I heard the same creaks and bends of the wooden frame, and I heard similar chair legs scrape against the hardwood floor in my upstairs neighbor's apartment whenever I pulled my own away from the kitchen table. There was nothing to convince me that my neighbor had placed comparable furniture in the same corners of her rooms, with the same faulty springs, and had taken up my exact routine, standing and sitting, showering and flushing the toilet in unison with me. In fact, I had no reason to doubt my landlord's words, as he told me that she had paid in advance for the month, and that he had even agreed to check in on her apartment a few times while she was away. As soon as I heard that, I begged him to let me accompany him on his first visit to her domicile. Just for my peace of mind, and with much conviction and incessant reminders on our run-ins in the laundry room, he finally allowed me to shadow him on his check-in, and I was not surprised to see that her furniture was much different than my own. She didn't own wooden kitchen chairs or springy sofas like mine. She had rattan chairs and a solid block of a futon on opposite ends of the room. In fact, her entire apartment was an opposite image of mine, with the kitchen and living room reversed, and my landlord was quick to say he'd told me so. But as we stepped out of her apartment, I heard the same creaks above my head again, in the apartment above hers, and my landlord did not seem fazed in the slightest, as that neighbor was most certainly home. But why would that neighbor's door open and close at the same time as ours? I became so obsessed that I devised a plan to spot the mystery walker with my own eyes and solidify my madness, and I knew that the outside terrace was my answer. I had avoided it up until that point, most afraid of watching the wooden boards on the terrace above me bend and groan. But I didn't look up to see it, at least not at first. I certainly heard it, the pressure of the unseen feet pressing and releasing along with the rhythm I set in motion as I dipped my own toes outside my sliding glass door. It was copying me, whatever it was, perfectly, step by step, just as I had always sensed it. I wondered if living in such close quarters with someone could do that to two people. Somehow synchronize our natural body rhythms, sync our unconscious minds so that we both felt the itching impulse to fetch that glass of water from across the room, or wake up at the same late hour of the night to relieve our bowels. But as I stood on my back porch, I knew this was not the case at all, as whoever it was, Lilith or my neighbor's unnamed house-sitter, it knew I was down there, and it was mirroring me perfectly. And worst of all, it knew I knew it was there. When I finally did crane my neck, standing stock still in the pounding of my own throat-clogged heartbeat, I saw the shadow of this person through the slats in the boards, as still as me. And when I dared to shift my weight forward against the handrail, I saw the shadow move in tandem. I almost screamed, and a terrifying thought of this thing screaming with me prevented me from ever opening my mouth. My intention had been to lean over the railing and look up, but I couldn't bring myself to place my hands on the guardrail. I didn't want to see her gnarled fingers, even though I had only a week ago dreamt of those fingers running through my hair in the heated passion of love. In my mind's eye, those were no longer my lover's well-manicured nails, but the twisted claws of a hag, plum-colored flesh slipping off like latex gloves, and nails lifting up at the cuticles when pressed against the cold steel. No, Raider, I did not follow through with my plan, but I did squint my eyes and peek across the street at the apartment building exactly opposite, where I could see my own reflection in one of the far-off windows. Then I shifted my eyes upward, just a click, to catch a glimpse at what might be standing directly above my head, and I only caught a glimpse, just enough to blur my eyesight and spin my head. I tried to look again, but the reflection was gone, and I only stared at an empty terrace. And was my own terrace now empty too? I tore back inside my apartment and sprinted across the hardwood into my bedroom, listening to the same furious pounding on the ceiling above me, which finally caused my clogged screams to unleash. I scratched with my belongings under my bed, and I ended up searching the rest of the night for my wicker doll, which seemed to have walked out my door. Even the record was gone. Against my better judgment, I racked my brain to reconjure the image in my memory, even as my brain was dedicated to scrubbing it clean forever, for my own good. But I did not relent, and there on my bedroom floor I was able to piece it all together, like a dream I had been struggling to recall for the greater part of the day. And what I had seen on the third-floor balcony did not have any place in my world, or any others as far as I was concerned. She hadn't looked like my wicker look-alike, but something hybridized, like a scarecrow or a mannequin that was unraveling around the roughest of her edges, bits of straw poking out of her shoulders and waist, or like pieces of jagged bone, now that I think of it. But there was noticeable shape to her hips and bosom that my doll had not possessed, which gave her more pronounced animation. As difficult as it is to explain, this was not a doll, but something with substance and dark as pitch, and her hair, God, it was like a bird's nest or trembling beehive, and her whole person had pulsated, flickering like a flame before it was gone. And just before the sun had begun to set, the music started to play in the apartment above me, muffled somewhere, far underwater, but somehow right there in the room with me, so loud that I couldn't drown it out with the most obnoxious commercials or the fullest dishwasher full of clanking wine glasses. It was so unbearable that I tore out of my apartment and piled into the elevator, too afraid to hear the same manic footsteps coming down the stairwell after me, as I was sure they would catch up with me this time. The elevator took me safely to the roof, and I crossed the black tar deck in the dying light just in time to catch the sunset, and I finally regained my breath for the first time in weeks, looking out across my city. I, of course, made sure that the emergency exit door was not about to swing open behind me, and it never did, thankfully, though I didn't think I'd ever be able to leave that roof or enter my apartment again. And, well, I never did enter it again, reader. I got off the roof, but it wasn't down those stairs, and it wasn't over the side of the building, or else I wouldn't be here to recount these words to you, jotted down in the back of that cursed journal I intend to lose as quickly as I can. You know, the thought never occurred to me there at the end of this sordid tale. My nostrils flared to at least fill my head with that sweet air, free from hellish choruses or creaking boards. It should have been in the back of my paranoid mind, which had long been ravaged by the belief that the Devil's Bride herself of Gnostic legend was sharing the same apartment building, the same bedroom, with me and me alone. But I was not expecting the drop of water as it spotted my forearm, and then my scalp. And looking down at the raising goose flesh on my arm, somehow I knew it wasn't rain at all but oil. I could even smell the alcohol on the air. And yes, I did look up, out of pure instinct, mind you, and locked eyes with the Lady Lilith that night. I was meant to receive uninterrupted her psychotic smile, full of elongated, spotless, inhuman teeth. I was destined to experience that electric shock through my innermost core as her orange eyes wavered and focused to zero in on me. They blazed like stars, and her fire caught in my own skull until my eyes overflowed with tears and I was forced to blink or else blind myself in that horrid sunspot. And her swan-like neck twisted just enough for her to stare down between her gray-toned, calloused toes at me, floating perhaps 2-3 feet above the tip of my nose. Her naked breasts, marked with raised turquoise veins, swelled with a shredding breath, and her red lips thinned as they pulled tighter into a smile too bright for her mouth. Still, her youthful beauty was appalling, her symmetrical cheekbones raised with a blush and the hint of a dimple and a wrinkle above the straight bridge of her nose. And the alcohol and oil poured off her in torrents, dripping off her reaching talons and the split ends of her twisted braids, which pulled her hairline tight halfway down the backside of her skull. "Lover," she cooed, directly in the cup of my ear, with a voice like gravel and rose petals crunching underfoot. But I was already scrambling for the fire escape, and I tumbled down all 5 flights. I couldn't have struck the pavement at the bottom any faster, or with any more sweet, unconscious relief, as I at least knew I wouldn't have to sleep in my bed that night, or any night for that matter. I gave everything I owned to Lilith that day, and it was adequately understood that my apartment and everything in it, record and doll included, were now hers, in exchange for the leather journal, of course, which contained all instruction on how to conjure, but not to banish. I found it at my hospital bedside when I woke up for the first time with 50 stitches in my temple and my right eye swollen shut, a parting gift from my almost lover, I'm sure, as I would never see her again, at least not in my waking hours. But I don't mind those dreams as much, as I am always so relieved to be alive when I wake from them. What that means for the longer sleep at the end of this life, I don't want to think about right now, though I'm sure our marriage bed will be as cold and stiff as I always remember it. And no, I never lived in a downstairs apartment ever again, only in a single-floor mobile home with heavy insulation on the exterior roof that would dampen even the loudest squirrel scratches or wet slaps of bare, naked feet. The thing on the threshold. When the confirming ding resounded between her ears, Matilda ruminated on the fact that it always drummed up the same feeling of dread within her. Why, she couldn't rightly say, but she likened it to the dread she felt on her own, knowing that she woke up every day with no prospects or new leads to carry her down the road toward career success and a family. The ding in her head was a reminder of that ticking clock in her life, that she was gifted with one more day to make a connection, but the system in the receiver in everyone else's skull would prevent her from ever progressing. Something was different about this day, Matilda could be sure. Looking around at the graveyard shift reception desk and computer monitor set up in front of her, with all of its security camera postage stamps, told her that it was just another night and another dollar. It was just her in the lobby, as with every night, and she could at least be thankful that it wasn't like her first nights on the job, when the elderly patients were up and about after hours and she was required to summon up enough authority to calm them, come down to their level, and then lead them back to bed. Once she proved to herself that she could do the hard parts of the job, the patients stopped leaving their beds at night. Or maybe they didn't trust her and were afraid of confronting her in the night. Either way, it made for a quiet graveyard shift, and she would need a little bit more excitement to stay awake, And Sudoku puzzles were not doing it for her. Ordinarily, she would just overload her guts with steaming coffee rather than logging on to the Connect 2 system. Like most teens growing up, she had tooled around with the skull-to-skull technology, but she only needed to navigate the downtown streets to know who most of the customers of this technology were. Anyone new to her city might look at the vast amount of vagabonds carrying out intelligent conversations with themselves and think the social fabric was unraveling. Although Matilda would agree with that testimony wholeheartedly, she knew that the vast majority of these homeless men and women were on board the Connect 2 system and were speaking with their remote pen pals, friends from other parts of the planet that the system had paired them with to share their head and thoughts for the rest of the day, or the rest of their lives if they were compatible enough. Connect 2 was released on the aftermath of depressive cases sweeping Matilda's city, and loneliness was the major culprit. Matilda's job prevented her from meeting people, at least anyone her age, so she was willing to kill the boredom any way she could, even if that meant she would be paired with one of these sorry souls living in the gutter outside her door. She often fired up the Connect 2 receiver in her skull by plugging the adapter into the permanent earpiece attached to the side of her skull, and everyone else she knew. She used the adapter and its separate controller to log onto the internet and select the Connect 2 server. Often she scrolled through the names and professions of all the current users, but could never pull the trigger, as she was looking for someone like her, she supposed, working some night shift and bored off her tits, looking for a new best friend. But, like usual, most of the users had men's names, and they hadn't bothered to list their professions, which told her they were most likely living in the tent cities just 20 minutes down the main street from her. She didn't really want to share her headspace with a man, as she had never done it before, and even though there were plenty of fail-safes to block any user and excommunicate yourself from the system with the touch of a button, she considered herself to be a sensitive, an empath, and her encounters with miserable and tortured people in person were enough to leave bad impressions and trauma on her, so she wondered what a tortured soul could do to her from within. She shuddered at the thought, but on this night she was willing to roll the dice, as there was a name she found listed with his current profession, and she was able to deduce right away that this man was at his job like her, and the night was still young. It wasn't the fact that he was a graveyard shifter like her that she finally selected his name and sent an invitation to connect. No, it was the profession he had listed under his name. He worked at the Akram Institute, which had gained a reputation in the city for operating in the Black Ops programs, working with military intelligence groups. No one really knew what the firm did, as they seemed to work with marketeers and psychologists to introduce the greatest new fad medicine. But it wouldn't seem that they were just a research lab for pills, as they also bought up land, engineered livestock, developed TV packages for news channels to feature their new product, participated in oil spill cleanups and humanitarian efforts, and even built rockets that they shot into space. Matilda wondered what they didn't do, but she also knew that anyone who worked for Akram signed an NDA. She'd heard that from a family member who used to work there, who likened it to a Freemason kind of brotherhood that he would never betray for threat of incarceration. Matilda had the sense that the repercussions were much worse than that, just judging by the twinge of pain that had been alive on her great-uncle's face when he spilled the beans to her. "Hello, is this Matilda?" a sunny and youthful male asked in her ears. Her shoulders immediately relaxed to know that this man was young. Hadn't her pre-teen friends and her first signed on to that program to meet boys? Isn't that why anyone would let someone into their own heads with them? "Yes, is this John? From Akram?" she replied out loud. Although Connect 2 could transfer silent thoughts between participants, it was safer to drown out the thoughts and feelings with actual words. She didn't want to give away how flushed she was at that moment, for instance, even though she wondered if it was apparent in her voice. "Ah, I see I got someone's attention with that," John replied with an audible chuckle. "You know, most people skip over my name when they see Akram listed. Everyone's interested in speculating about the rumors on the web, but the moment they get a chance to meet someone beyond the curtain, they shy away. The conspiracy has a much bigger weight than what I can ever shed light on. So you're saying all the stories are bunk then? You aren't working with off-world entities? I can tell by your voice you're making a joke, John replied. Would I be on this platform if my job was that exciting? Matilda laughed. I suppose not. You're working an 8-hour? I'll be doing a double, John replied. I'm on my last leg now. Oh, wow. So are you safe to talk then? John paused and they both heard static in their skulls. I'd like to know what you do first, if I could. Tell me about your interesting job, Matilda. It can't be all that bad. Oh, I like it just fine, she said. I just man the reception desk while all our elderly residents are sleeping. I work at an old folks' home. That must be very rewarding. I respect that very much, Matilda, John said. I'm working a double right now, so I have enough to support my grandma at home. That's wonderful to hear, John. My grandma is my favorite person in the world. What's her name? Maxine, John said with pride. I'd love to give back to her and her friends with a job like yours. Give me the exciting details. Matilda laughed again. Not a whole lot of excitement here tonight, or any night for that matter, John. The people who live here are the sweetest ever. There has to be someone manning the reception desk for a reason, John proposed. There must be something you provide that no one else can. Well, if you want to go woo with me, I've been kept on my toes a few times, Matilda ventured with the same light-hearted tone. Sometimes I'll see the front doors open themselves and catch a hint of someone passing around a corner. None of the residents ever seem to leave, even after they die. I kind of treat them as our secondary clientele. So I'll wave and greet them when the front doors open by themselves. I figure they're just coming in from a midnight walk, which they were never allowed to take when they lived here. I don't blame them at all. I'll even joke with them that their secret is safe with me. Matilda was met with a surge of fear and pain through her skull that she'd never experienced before, and it left her reeling, gripping the edge of her desk and watching the room spin as she hung on for dear life. As soon as it passed, she was struck with a mental image of an empty cell, cold, white, and luminescent. And she knew that this wasn't her experience, but John's. John, is everything all right? Matilda asked. Yes, he said calmly. I'm here. Did we disconnect for a minute? I was just going to say how creepy all that sounds. Your job is more exciting than you give it credit for. I just saw something, Matilda said, shaking her head as if to dislodge the thought. It was a cell, but it was empty. Why is it so scary? If it wasn't for these devices we were born with, I would swear you were a mind reader, John said. I'm connected with all my emergency contacts, like I'm sure you are, and I've never had them pick up on visual thoughts from my head. With the kind of work I do, I would be in big trouble for even talking to you right now as I am. I guess I understand now. Sorry, I didn't mean to pry, Matilda said. My friends call me an empath because I can feel everything they do, even before they tell me what's happening in their lives. They don't like to share with me here and connect too for that reason. Well, that's a bit embarrassing then, John said. Here you are describing your encounter with the spirit world, and you have no fear at all. In fact, you're comforted because they're good ghosts. I didn't know good ghosts existed, but I would take a sweet old lady any day over. I'm sorry, we don't have to talk about it, Matilda cut in. She wasn't sure she wanted to explore that cell any further with John anyway. I have one job, Matilda, and that's to watch this cell at the end of the hall. The glass walls are polarized, so I'm not allowed to see inside most of the time. Sometimes I've peeked in through one of the chinks in the glass, but that cell's always been empty. You watch over an empty cell at night? They tell me it's not empty is the thing, John said, his voice hushed now. I feed whatever it is twice a night, but the meat I feed it is incinerated to ash. When I drop it into the cell, it's always gone the next day. Of course, they won't tell me what it's all about, so I can only speculate. What kind of animal would eat meat turned to ash? Matilda asked. Animal? I'm not so sure about any of that, John answered cautiously. The qualifications for the job were extensive, mostly the health check. I had to be at exceptional health. They won't hire anyone over the age of 40 to work on the floor, and I can only think it has something to do with the meat. The steaks I'm provided here are raw, and even in the fridge, they rot faster than normal. Anything that's already dead rots much faster here. I killed a fly once and watched it shrivel and flake away to nothing, right in front of my eyes. What could it be? Some experiment? I don't ask questions like that. Not around here, Matilda, John said. But I don't think it's alive. At least in the sense that we're alive. How can that be? Says the girl who just told me doors open on their own in her place of work, John shot back, and he wasn't laughing this time. It's the same reason you know your midnight visitors are friendly ghosts. I look at that cell and at the gray hairs on my head, and I don't think it's anything good. As soon as he finished saying that, Matilda yelled out when the automatic doors slid open in front of her desk, stalling there a moment for the unseen visitor to step beyond the sensor, and then pushing closed again. Something wrong? John asked. Matilda stared at the welcome mat, unsure whether she should laugh or spring away from her desk and through the same automatic doors. Don't tell me you just saw something, John cried excitedly. The doors just opened, Matilda heaved. Usually it doesn't surprise me that much, but the fact that we were just talking about it concerns me a bit. It's like they're listening. I guess that's my fault then, John began. Maybe I should... He was cut off by a bang that set off a series of curses on the other end and loud footfalls down the hall. Then silence. John, talk to me. What happened? He was breathing loudly now, and those waves of fear were fresh, weighing down Matilda's head like torrents of water. Yes, Matilda, I just got startled is all, John said at the tails of a deep breath. One of the office doors just banged open here. I've never seen that in my life. And whatever just walked in, I felt a cold wind go past my desk, going down the hall, and I had to run the other way. Down the hall, you think? I wish I had your same conviction, John said. You can watch a door open and know it's one of your residents, but here, how can I trust anything I can't see? Matilda found that she was still staring doubtfully at the welcome mat in front of the front doors, somehow aware that she was still being watched. And it didn't feel friendly, not this time. I don't know if I could ever be sure, Matilda breathed. I just assumed, but... Oh God, John cried. The polarized glass, it's gone, I can see inside. What? What's happening? Matilda was standing upright now. Hold on, more scuffling feet. Good Lord, it's freezing, Matilda. Does it get cold like this for you? Before Matilda could respond, she heard a loud click, and there was no ignoring the sound of a large and sticky door swinging open. John screamed then, and the sound of the opening door receded as he no doubt sprinted to the other end of the hall, his footsteps thundering against the wall. Matilda felt sick to her stomach, and she doubled over, smelling the rotten meat in her nostrils and listening to the man's loud wheezing in her ears. Your ghost, John screamed. It opens doors, not just the lobby ones. What? My ghost, what do you... It's open, he yelled, still running, still hyperventilating. Then the loud alarms cut off the rest of the background noise, and when Matilda closed her eyes, she could see the red lights flashing from the bulbs in the ceilings. An old lady? John shrieked. She's laughing at me. Jesus, she's in here with us. Don't you hear her laughing? Grandma Max, she's screaming. Don't touch her. A loud door slammed on the other end, muffling the sirens, and the sound of echoing footsteps told Matilda that he was running down a stairwell now. And what replaced the alarm sounds were clearly the wicked laughter of a woman, somewhere riddled in the static of the Connect 2 device, and the far-off screams of countless elderly men and women. And was that her own grandma she was hearing now? She heard an actual moan down the hall from her, from one of the closed rooms, and she rounded around the desk to poke her head down the dimly lit passageway. As soon as the moan came again, but from a different source across the hall, Matilda heard John squeak to a halt on his rubber soles, screaming at the top of his lungs as something loud cracked and something else spilled across the floor. Before the connection between both of their skulls was severed with the same audible ding that connected them, Matilda saw an image of the olive-eyed beast, no longer invisible and very solid. It was there on the final step of the stairwell, albino-skinned, hairless, and hunched forward on long appendages that ended in blade-like claws. Its pumpkin-shaped head reared up in her mind's eye, seeming to recognize that there were two of them sharing that head. And when its claw shot forward to extract John from his own skull, they went scratching around in there for her, but she had already evacuated, ripping the earpiece from the side of her head in a torrent of warm blood. Bursting into the nearest room, the moaning had changed to blood-curdling screeches, and before Matilda could press the emergency button on the wall and call in backup, the old man in the bed had already noticed her and pointed a gnarled finger at the farthest ceiling corner. She could see the albino thing dancing in the man's wavering, bulging eyes, so she didn't have to look up to know that they were no longer alone. It was ready to feed, but perhaps not on her bones. She could only hope there in her last moments. It fed on things that were already dead or near death. Then she looked down at her shirt front, at the bright red stain spreading there from the wound in her ear, and she knew she was already there. She breathed to herself in the end and looked up at the olive eyes and open oval of a mouth, sucking up the dead air, dust, and skin like a vacuum, and knew that she had brought it there, and it told her in her mind that it would feed on her last, even as its claws still dripped with John's crimson lifeblood, smearing against the ceiling plaster as it readjusted itself for purchase on its perch. Matilda thought she could hear the screams in her head. There was only one way to sever that connection, the thing told her, and she begged for it, dropping to her knees. But she knew she'd have to hear it for a little while longer, the pleas and cries of the gentle soul she'd cared for over her last year on the job, and she'd have to hear the last gasping cry of each one before the sun could return. She pictured the cell in her mind's eye, attempting to push the creature inside, but all she managed to do was shut the white glowing door on herself. At least the screaming had stopped. At least she was no longer bleeding. And she wouldn't have to inspect her own blood-streaked arms and legs, as they were now invisible. She settled down on the floor in a ball, staring up at the burning white light above her head, and she wondered when dinner time was. Invitation to an exorcism. As Brett entered the stuffy Victorian-style house in the suburbs of Denver, the smell of pet dander and old antiques immediately transported him to another time, to a secluded, discarded cupboard space in his distant childhood, where his most admittedly suppressed fear resided in the form of an old black-and-white grainy video, played and replayed on repeat in his head since he was 8 years old. In that faded yet oddly well-aged memory, a ghost girl, transparent blue, in a white dress, strode across the dining room floor in mid-step in only a snapshot image, completely unaware of him. He hoped that this would be his last time entering the house, but he quickly revised that thinking once realizing that he'd have to return at least one more time to drop off his aunt's bulldog at the end of the month. He was there to do a favor for his Aunt Julie and make some money in the process. Recently graduating from college, the few $100s would go a long way towards supplementing some of his fees racked up from the expensive trips to the grocery store. And there weren't many other gigs on the horizon besides his usual customers who needed a house/dog sitter. Aunt Julie was his most recent customer, who would be attending a university conference that required the entire psychology department to travel out of state for a few weeks. Thankfully, she didn't need a house sitter, as Brett had dreaded the 5 or 10 minutes he would have to spend in the doorway of the mansion while his aunt handed off the leash of her bulldog to him. No, he could take the dog with him home, and he was more than happy to take the invitation to gather his check and leave. Aunt Julie greeted him in the parlor, but her bulldog was absent from the scene. The abundance of porcelain dolls staring at him from the nearest glass case were certainly present, and Brett averted his eyes to an oil painting of a stern-looking woman in a red gown, flashing accusatory eyes in his direction, and he quickly stared at his feet. At age 59, Aunt Julie hobbled forward on her cane, her face heavily caked in makeup but youthful all the same, and genuinely bright and smiling at the sight of him. It had been about a year, since last Thanksgiving, since he'd seen her, and the leg compression and boot on her enlarged foot were somewhat of a surprise for him, although he knew she had complained of a history of gout on several occasions in his company. Brett noticed how cold it was in the parlor, even with all the windows closed and the furnace growling somewhere beneath their feet. The 3 layers of sweaters and scarf around Julie's neck were at least proof enough that he wasn't overreacting. "Brett, Sonny, how long has it been since you've been in my humble abode?" Julie asked him, keeping her wide berth. He couldn't help but notice that she wasn't calling for her dog or handing over the check, as he had hoped to begin their conversation. "It has to be over 10 years, Brett sighed. "It can't have been that long, could it?" she asked rhetorically, shaking her head and allowing a few slivers of silver bangs to slip free from her hair tie. "Surely the night of our last scare wasn't your final visit?" "No, I think I made it for a couple more Halloween parties before I got too old," he said. Yes, I'm afraid I've grown out of that phase as well, she replied, lost in a memory that Brett thought he was currently sharing with her. You'll be happy to know I haven't used that Ouija board since that night. Brett shrugged, trying to seem nonchalant and inadvertently locking eyes with the glass-eyed doll again. It's just a toy. I had an overreactive imagination then. Come now, we know we both have seen something in this house, she ventured with a raised eyebrow. You didn't tell anyone of the little girl you saw walking across this very floor, until you overheard me telling your mom about the same little girl I saw peek around that corner, there. She indicated the half wall separating the living room from the main stairs. I saw her as clear as day, and when she saw me, she booked it up those stairs like I was playing tag with her. You blurted out that you saw the same thing, validating both of our stories. With all the dolls you have, it could be that we both projected the little girl, like a hallucination, Brett offered unconvincingly. Aunt Julie smiled and tapped her cane on the wooden floor. I'm a psychologist. I'm supposed to say things like that to you, she chortled as she neared the cellar door, fingering the knob. A ripple of pain coursed through Brett's skull, and he had to steady himself against the glass case of dead, staring faces. You know that wasn't the end of it, don't you? Aunt Julie asked. I figured, since you never spoke of it again, that you might have suppressed the rest of your memories of that Halloween night. The remainder of that night was pretty traumatizing for us both. The rest of the night? Brett asked. You and my parents messed around with the Ouija board for fun, but me and my cousins went upstairs to play. We were scared to be in the same room with you. Correction, your cousins went up to play, but I found you in the basement, Aunt Julie said, opening the door and allowing an even colder wind to invade the parlor. The darkness sitting solid and heavy beyond that door was not disturbed in the slightest by the lamplight flickering on the mantel behind them. I've never been down there, but accompanying that unwelcome pain in his head was a memory of a dream he'd had once as a kid, where he had stood on the threshold of those basement steps, looking down on a grinning and silvery black panther at the bottom of the stairs. As soon as it moved to clear the distance between them, Brett had reared out of his sleep with what he could only think was comparable to a heart attack, threatening to break open his ribcage. I heard you screaming down there, and when I went down, you were basically catatonic, unresponsive, and I saw something I'll never forget, something I haven't told anyone. Not your mother, not my late husband, she continued, squaring herself up in front of the solid black doorway. I don't want to hear any more, Brett said with a heaving breath. If I could just get the dog and leave. I'm not going out of town, Brett, she said matter-of-factly, gazing down the steps as he had done in his dream. I only said that to get you here. I need you to do something for me. You lied? She ignored him. I'm not afraid in this house, not anymore. The demon that lives down there knows this. We're attached, it and me. We have been since I was a girl, but it can't scare me anymore. Ever since it took my husband's life, feeding off him like a cancer, I haven't been afraid to die. Being a widow is much worse than death, the greatest torture of them all, and it successfully broke me. Now it's moved on to new victims, unfortunately. Brett, my neighbors. I get calls all hours of the night from Mrs. Tettridge next door, who says she's seeing our little girl running up and down the stairs. But we both know it's not a little girl. I know you saw it, too, that night, and you fought it, successfully. I don't know what you're talking about. None of that happened. You're the only one who can help me, Brett, to help my neighbors, because you're like me. Like you? You have a demon inside you, which you've carried for a very long time, I can tell. I have something similar. It's been with me since my mom, God rest her soul, bought me my first child-sized doll at an estate sale. When I brought that doll into the house, I unknowingly let the demon traveling with that doll into my heart. It's been with me ever since. It takes the form of a girl, in hopes that we'll drop our guard. But we were never fooled, were we? The nightmare was so bright in his mind now, replaying like an unshakable example of déjà vu, which he was no longer convinced was a dream at all. I saw its true form down there in the basement, when I came to rescue you, and it was throwing dirt at the floor in front of my feet, cowering there in the corner. I could tell it was cornered. It was intimidated by something you did, or something your passenger did, and I looked at it in the face, just briefly, its snake-like, scaled, greenish face, as its claws tore around its vicinity to throw more dirt at us, and it was gone. I would remember something like that, Brett croaked, with a hard swallow. Something that terrifying when you're that young? I've encountered many patients who compartmentalize that kind of trauma. Some of it might bleed out in your dreams. What is your worst nightmare? I know you must have one. Brett thought that the only way to relinquish the building pressure in his chest would be to unclog his throat and speak. I sometimes dream of a panther stalking me, sneering, just before it pounces, and I wake up. She nodded at the new draft that exhaled from the open basement's gaping mouth. That must be your passenger. Ever figure out where it might have latched onto you? Brett swallowed another burning lump. Sometimes in my dreams, it will morph from the black rabid cat that attacked me once in the green mill behind my house when I was 5. I still have the scars on my legs from where it came at me. I'm so sorry, Brett, but I'm gonna have to ask you to go down there with me tonight. Why? He begged. Whatever lives inside of you, it doesn't get along with what's inside of me, she replied. And that Halloween night, the activity in the house died off for a very long time, months even, before I finally saw that little girl on the stairs. The doll, my very first one, disappeared that night as well, and I never found it again. I always thought that was the reptile thing covering its bases. He was vulnerable for the first time. I could see it in his little amber eyes down there in the cellar, and I think he wanted to make sure that his totem, the source of his power, was protected from anyone with the wherewithal to harm it, or him. I can't be the one to help you, Brett argued. You need a priest or an exorcist. We both do, most likely, Julie countered. But I think you have the next best thing. It's scared, whatever lives down there, more than it ever scared me or my husband. I wouldn't even know what to do. Julie smiled and took his hand. He grudgingly allowed her to lead him closer to the basement, closer to the ice box beyond. Just let your black cat do it for you. Julie led the way, slowly down the creaking steps into the dirt floor at the bottom. She allowed Brett to cling to her sweater, and he felt surprisingly safe pressed to her back, where her steady heartbeat seemed to set the pace for his own, jackhammering against her spine. She did not flinch or shake as she reached up to pull the cord on the light bulb above their heads, and they looked around at the unassuming dirt cellar with its haphazard array of boxes and glowing furnace in the corner. It was so cold down there, but Brett felt a pleasant breath of fire against his scalp from the vent directly above him, and he chose to stay there as Julie navigated toward the center of the room. She pointed her cane at the corner opposite the furnace. That's where I saw it. Do you think it's down here now? She frowned, closing her eyes. It's hard to say. It moved around quite a bit, according to what I hear from my neighbors. It could be elsewhere, but it'll show up if we find the doll. You think it's down here still? I don't know where else it could be, she replied. This is where I had it stashed for the longest time, once I realized it was the cause of all the problems. But it was placed on top of one of the boxes there. And, yes, I've dug through all the boxes, checked every square inch of this house. It's not anywhere obvious. Maybe you can find it for me. How? Let your cat sniff it out. That's ridiculous. And then what, destroy it? I think I should have destroyed it a long time ago, instead of hiding it down here. But it was my most prized possession, even with all the horror attached to it. I loved it in my own way. I've never heard that destroying cursed objects ever does any good, Brett countered. I thought you had a scientific explanation for everything, Julie pressed with a knowing smile. Why do you think I held on to it for so long? I tend to agree with you. Something that otherworldly most likely requires destruction through otherworldly means. Brett hugged his arms across his freezing chest defiantly and protectively. I don't know what you think I can do. The furnace fired on with such force that they both jumped, and the muscles in Brett's back quickly loosened when the warm air washed over him again. He saw the flaps on one of the boxes moving behind his Aunt Julie, and this almost sent him bolting back up the stairs when he realized the boxes were beneath a second air vent connected to the furnace. However, it seemed that the air coming out of the second grate was much more pronounced, and he circled around his aunt with a look of concentration that led him to the air vent with both arms over his head. He was correct that the air was much fiercer there in the back of the basement than the front. He traced the vent back to his former standing place, motioning for Julie to feel what he was feeling without speaking. As soon as she was positioned under the grate by the stairs, they heard the bulldog Harold begin to bark and tear across the hardwood floor with his nails clicking. He bumped something and it fell hard against the floor, and he continued to bark at the foot of the stairs. We're on to something, Brett breathed quietly. They could not see the dog at the top of the stairwell, but the barks were intensifying and pounding against the eardrums in Brett's head. Above us? Julie asked. In the vent, Brett said. He touched the cold metal of the vent above his head and traced it to the other corner of the basement, to the next grate, and he saw again that even less air was coming through there. Without asking, he extracted the vent cover and peered into the darkness. He saw a glint of light in there, way in the back near the wall, and he knew instinctively that it was a reflection from a glass eye. It's in The dog's bark died, and they heard him gallop away across the floor above, colliding into something else and falling still. What replaced that void of silence was the sound of something pounding through the vent above their heads, and what could only be considered the laughter of a female child. They could even see the metal crumpling as the heavy weight thundered toward Brett. "Grab it!" Aunt Julie screamed from somewhere far away, and Brett reached into the dark mouth of the vent, wrapped his fingers around the moth-eaten dress, and wrenched the child-sized thing out of the vent. And then he dropped it to the floor. Gangly, dripping, scaly claws reached after the broken doll on the ground, but closed around Brett's throat instead, lifting him off the ground until the toes of his sneakers were balanced on the dirt. He looked up into the blood-orange eyes and felt the putrid breath waft over his face as it hissed, speckling him with its lava-hot spit. A deep, cat-like growl replied, vibrating with his chest, and the claws withdrew into the darkness just as the black, silvery blur flashed between Brett's legs and scooped up the old doll in its jaws. It then proceeded toward the stairs, ripping through the fabric parts of the doll like a dog with its chew toy, and the panther made sure to smash the doll's porcelain face against the stairway wall. And then it carried its kill up the stairs, across the den floor, and through the front door without ever opening it. The thing in the vent screamed, and it was no longer a child's voice, but a dragon, screeching as it died. Brett could hear it slithering away, back toward the furnace, and the smoke that poured out of the grates told Aunt Julie and Brett that the reptile was burning. And then the vent was spitting white ash, dusting the dirt floor as the thing's cries receded into nothing. Aunt Julie was quickly at his side, inspecting his neck as he dusted the ash off his own shoulders. "Next, I was going to ask how we were going to rid yourself of your passenger," Aunt Julie said, "but I think you might want to hold on to that one." Harold barked from the top of the stairs, as if to remind them both why Brett was there in the first place. They hugged and laughed there in the middle of the basement, and both of them felt lighter, as if for the first time. "You can put my check in the mail," Brett said. "Roast me." "Sometimes those who wander are lost," read the final text he ever sent Alana. It had been a long week since his final correspondence, and the countless texts and voice messages she had relinquished on him had only piled up as an impassable route of emotional water in her chest. After only a few months dating, Andrew had stopped answering her, and that final response had served as a digging thorn that she had dissected to no end. She had simply been quoting one of her favorite expressions, "Sometimes those who wander are not lost," and he had replied with the complete inverse of this foundational statement of her life, puzzling her for hours and days with no end. She had replied back with, "LOL, you know what I mean," hoping that it had only been a quippy joke that hadn't landed, and he was waiting to follow up with the real punchline. When he didn't respond, she came to believe that he had been geared toward hurting her the entire time, and the next string of texts she sent to his unresponsive phone followed the 5 stages of grief to a T. After giving him the benefit of the doubt, she then became angry, and then started bargaining, pleading for a response of any kind. Then depression fell over her like a blanket, and her girlfriend Stacy quickly noticed this one day as they were sitting down at the mall's food court one afternoon. "Just goes to show how much you can really know someone," Stacy said, furrowing her brow as she worked with the memory in her head. Or perhaps the smoothie she had already inhaled had caused her mind to freeze over. "I'm glad I never met him. Or maybe I should have. You know I have a great nose for creeps." Alana sighed, fiddling with her full, untouched plastic cup of water she'd gotten at the smoothie shop. "I didn't introduce you to him for that very reason. You're too judgmental." "Well, I should have saved you some time. How many times did you actually meet? Once, 2 times, and always in front of his house? Anyone who doesn't invite you in is hiding something." "He had roommates," Alana argued. "I've done similar things with my boyfriends. He didn't want his slob friends to be my first impression of him." "How can you still be defending a guy who ghosted you? You've never told a boy you love him before, so don't ask me again why I'm worried about the boyfriend I haven't talked to in a week." "Fine, if you're so worried for him, then go to his house. Maybe his roommates have killed him and are eating him as we speak. Would that make you feel better?" Alana slammed down her water cup so hard that it cracked and bled over the table. "You don't think I've thought about that?" Stacy laughed and scooted her chair away from the table in case Alana decided to toss the rest of the water into her heavily blushed cheeks. "That his roommates are eating him? No! Going to his house. I've thought about confronting him,
but I don't think I can face off with someone who's already moved on. I won't put myself through that. Stacy frowned when the fun of her button pressing had run its course. But what if he really is in trouble? Hell, his grandma could have been in the hospital for the week. I think you owe it to yourself to at least put that question to bed. Maybe he's laid up in bed, and there's room for one more. Fuck off, Alana grunted, as she slouched down all the way into her uncomfortable metal chair. Is it worth pursuing peace of mind if it proves to me he's just a jerk? Yes, Stacy said seriously. Girl, the truth hurts. But you know me, I'll never know how to mind my own business. And if you don't go, I might just have to. You gave me an unsolved mystery. What the hell am I supposed to do with that? You're right. Alana smirked for the first time that day. I'll never hear the end of it. If you really love the guy, trust him, she said, and that's the only time you'll hear me give such good advice. She tossed the empty cup over her shoulder and missed the trash can completely. Alana's hatred for Andrew was quickly replaced with concern for his well-being, and although Stacy had insisted on following her to the house, Alana braved the wintry streets alone, riding the bus across town to the old side, and arrived at Andrew's house, an adobe-style domicile with an impressive collection of junk and trash littering the front porch. It did look like a group of young male roommates shared the house, as leaves clogged the gutters, paint peeled from the trim, and the lawn had been left to grow wild. Trying her best to suffocate her fear with the love that still sat tender in the seat of her chest, she approached the front porch and knocked on the door. No one answered. Not even a dog barked from the other side, even though Andrew had claimed that one of his roommates owned a pet. She thought about calling his number and listening with her ear to the door to see if she could hear it ringing from the other side, but quickly shook her head at her own self. She tried. There was really nothing else she could do short of banging the door down. As she was walking away, she watched someone clanging with the gate at the bottom of the walk. Adrenaline quickly spiked her blood, but it wasn't Andrew who approached her on the concrete path. Automatically, she assumed it was one of his roommates, and she racked her brain for one of their names as she made eye contact with the man, who wore a full beard and a navy blue pantsuit. He also had one of those professional businessman haircuts she'd seen in commercials for her local law firms, with the perfect ratio of buzz job and gel parting hairline along the right side of the head. Alana's first thought was how handsome and tall this man truly was, most likely in his late 20s, while she was only 19. She almost forgot this fact when she saw the bouquet of flowers in his hand, and automatically assumed they were for her. "Oh, hello, are you one of Tina's friends?" he asked, smiling politely, but not offering the flowers or any kind of handshake her way. He stopped about 6 feet away from her, even as she stupidly continued on until they were in breathing distance. "Tina?" she asked with a fumbling voice to match her feet. "Yeah, I just assumed, but there are enough people living in that house for me to assume incorrectly," he offered. This time he did hold up his hand as she gratefully shook it. It was as warm and thick as she'd hoped it was. "The name's James," he said, and she told him hers. "I'm Tina's boyfriend. I assume you must be one of Travis's friends, or maybe Andrew?" Her eyes flashed with recognition for the first time. "Yes," she barked, too excitedly for her visitor's volume level. "Well, sort of friends. We used to date." The tall man frowned down at her, allowing his gaze to drift slightly to rest on the house. "Sorry to hear that. I'm not sure what Tina and I are anymore either." Alana filed that info away in her head for future knowledge, mentally kicking herself for not putting more effort into her makeup and hair for the day. She was still wearing her dog-chewed moccasins for pity's sake. "I was just coming by to reconcile," he said. "I don't know if you know her at all." "No, I haven't met any of Andrew's roommates," she shot back at once. "Well, it isn't like her to ignore me like she has been. I'm here to get to the bottom of it." He shrugged with his flowers in hand. "Am I going too far, Alana?" "You're gonna think I'm lying," Alana said, finding it almost impossible to swallow the hot barb in her throat. "But I'm here for the same reason." "Really? How so?" "Andrew hasn't been answering my texts either." Now James really looked concerned, and he proceeded past her to toss the flowers in the trash heap and knock roughly on the door until it shook in its frame. Alana came up behind him, swaying back and forth uncertainly. You think they're in trouble, then? Tina, Andrew, and what was his name?" "Yes, I think they're in trouble," he replied without meeting her eyes, and he did not waste a moment in pushing open the door to reveal a living room that matched the porch outside. Dirty dishes and trash were piled on every surface, including the top of the tube TV and the speakers of the ancient and dust-encrusted stereo. "I had no idea this is how he lived," Alana said. Seeing that it was an adobe-style house, there was no second floor, so they wasted no time in covering every square inch, and this was not a difficult task. There was only one bedroom in the house, which was most concerning to Alana and James. "You haven't been in here either then?" she asked him. "No, she always came over to my place. I picked her up here, though," he replied distractedly as he closed the door on the bedroom. It didn't look like anyone had slept on the floor mattress in decades, and the trash and piles of crumpled cardboard boxes made it impossible to enter anyway. "Why would they tell us they lived in this squalor hole?" Alana questioned. "So they could ghost us later, I guess," he said with a quickly fading voice. "If we went looking for them, they could just disappear." Alana's eyes were drawn to the tube television when it flickered for a moment with static. She squared herself up in front of the screen, inspecting her own reflection in the glass. "Who the hell still has a tube TV?" she asked herself. She used the power button and felt a mechanism slide and trigger underneath her with the trapdoor that gave way and sent her plummeting onto the hard floor below. She hadn't fallen far, just enough to turn her ankle and bring stars to her vision as she collected in a ball. She looked up instantly at the letterbox square of light, some 12 feet high, in the ceiling above her. Everything else around her was shadows that danced with a far-off flickering light. James poked his head through the opening, but his face was too dark to determine what he was thinking. He certainly wasn't calling down to her. "James!" she screamed. "What? Please help me!" "I'm sorry, Alana, but there's only one way out of here," he explained calmly. "You gotta follow the hallways. Find Andrew and bring him back. That's why you're here." "What are you?" she screamed. "You did this!" "No, I only rigged the trapdoor for people like you. Like me," he said. "I was led to this house too, the hell if I know why. But there was a door in the floor, the one you just fell through. I never went down, but I've heard Tina down there, screaming. Find her and Andrew and bring them back to this door." Then he pulled away and left her to scream until she lost her voice, jumping with all her strength at the escape hatch just beyond reach. And when she checked her phone, she saw that she had no reception. Her only choice from there was to follow the flickering hallway, with burned-out lights in the ceiling that still buzzed from dirty electricity. The single claustrophobic hallway opened into an office or reception area of some kind, but there were no pieces of furniture, ringing phones, or doors leading to offices. At least here there were lights, but they dried out her eyes and filled her head with static that seemed to cancel out her thoughts. The reception area opened into several passageways, all leading to more rooms of differing sizes, carpets, and colored paint. But these slight derivations in decor were so slight that she almost missed the changes, from off-color white to eggshell, from shag carpeting to popcorn ceilings. But there were never any windows. Everything still had that mothball smell and waiting room atmospheres. All the while she screamed for help, navigating from one room to the next and not caring that she was hopelessly lost. At least every room she entered was different, as she assured herself, and that told her she was progressing. After passing through the 5th room, she came to a passage fully in the dark. Up until that point she had insisted on following a straight line through the labyrinth in case she wanted to backtrack. But now she would have to choose one of the left or right branches. She decided that she would rather turn back completely and hope that someone on the street could hear her cries. There was no telling how far this underground complex stretched, and when she checked her phone, she saw that nothing had changed. The minute she took it out, she watched another screen light up in the dark hall directly in front of her. It was enough light to illuminate the face of a young woman staring back at her. "Hi," she said, and even though Alana had already seen her before she spoke, she jumped. "I have a phone here we've been using. You can use that if you like." "Who?" Alana stared desperately down at the screen in her own hand, there in the middle of the empty room, and her voice returned to her after bouncing back from down one of the far passageways. "I'll trade you," the girl said, in the cast of her cell phone light. "It doesn't work for us anymore, but it should for you." "How do you know?" Alana managed. "The old phone works briefly for every newcomer, but your new one should work for me. I can call anyone you want. I can probably get you help." "Who are you?" Alana asked. Tina, the girl responded. James is up there. He trapped me down here, the girl nodded. He sent the last few down here searching for me, she explained dryly. He's a complete psycho. I'm sorry I ever started texting him. You know, he's the one who trapped Andrew down here, as he was jealous I was texting him. He's down here with you? Where? Hiding. We take our turns with the phone, Tina went on. Whoever has the new one can leave this place for a while. I spend my time with boys I like, just like Andrew hits up the girls. But there are a few of us down here, like you, Alana. We take our turns. So you'll get the phone soon, or the next one, when it stops working for the rest of us. How do you get out? Show me. We just kind of wake up in the house above us. It's not something we can control, it just happens. But the only way we can leave is by contacting someone on the surface. That establishes a real connection. Makes us real again, solid. With the phone? Alana brandished it at her shadowed visitor. It has no reception. I'm telling you, it'll work for us, Tina explained. That's how Andrew contacted you, with this phone, which we traded with the last girl who came down here. Girl? What girl? We never learned her name, but she's got to be around here somewhere, Tina replied with the same emotionless candor. No one dies down here, they just get lost. They run off and can't find their way back. Run off? Here, I'll toss you the phone. We'll slide them across the floor at the same time. Her face ducked away as she bent over to place the phone screen up on the carpet. She prepared to slide it. Why would I give you my phone? Alana snapped. Because it's the only way any of us can contact the outside world. Once one of us takes it back up to the surface, we'll charge it, and then it should work for you. But you have to give it away. Will you text my friend Stacy for me? It's unlocked, and she's one of the only contacts. Just let her know I'm alive under Andrew's house. Will you let her know? I will, Tina said straight-facedly. Slide it on 3. And your phone still has charge? It hasn't been to the surface for a week or so, but it has half charge. Ready? Alana placed her own phone on the carpet and slid it across the way on the count of 3 with Tina. She watched it disappear into the darkness and was surprised when the other phone, an old clamshell, bounced off her sneaker. She was about to call after Tina, but she had already disappeared with her phone. Call Stacy, you promised, Alana shot after her. Then she checked the flip phone at her feet and saw that it indeed had reception. A few bars and a half charge as promised. Looking at the contact list, there were a few saved numbers, including hers, and she followed the script of her text message conversation with Andrew for a few beats before one of the battery bars blinked out of existence. Without another thought, she punched in Stacy's number from her memory and called it. Her friend answered on the 3rd ring with a mouth full of something, berating the unknown robo-caller for disturbing her bath time. Stacy, it's me, Alana, calling from another phone, she yelled into the receiver. She had already turned on her heel to follow the straight line of hallways back to what she could only hope was the way she came in. Alana, what the hell? Where are you? I can barely hear you. Are you talking through one of those tin-can shoestring phones? I'm underground in some complex. It's never ending. What? I can't hear you. You're where? Underground. I don't know. Under Andrew's house. I'll text you the address. Andrew, is this his phone? But her voice died in mid-sentence, and Alana looked at the black screen to see the battery had officially died. And then the room shook so violently with what sounded like the thundering footsteps of a giant that the lights dimmed a few levels. Her first instinct was to run through endless halls, searching the ceiling for the trapdoor but never finding it, even as she passed through the 5th room that should have contained her one exit. So she kept running, and the footsteps thundered so loudly that blue emergency lights switched on. Then she started fleeing down any passageway she could find, just to put as much space between her and those approaching footfalls as possible. But she soon learned that she was running toward them when a hulking mass the size of a pickup truck filled up the ceiling-high doorway in front of her, and its black, featureless face screamed with a voice she could only attribute to a prehistoric dinosaur from the movies. Claws gripped the underside of the doorway as it ducked its massive head under for a closer look at her, and a silver and white reflective, revolving disc opened where its face should have been, expanding and narrowing at its apex like a funnel full of needlepoint teeth. She didn't even realize that she had dropped the phone as she took off the other way, screaming, crying, and then suddenly quiet. Her voice receded into the darkness with her haphazard steps, and the room swallowed everything else. Before a clawed foot smashed the hard plastic into splinters in the shag, a single message lit up the screen from Stacy, delivered somehow, but unread. Boys with aphantasia don't go missing. Tucker watched the driver door to the silver sedan open as he approached the dirt parking lot, his collapsed walking poles dangling from his sleeves as he reached out to shake the nervous-looking girl's hands. "Cindy?" Tucker proposed, dropping his hand when she made no indication of relinquishing her own from the front pockets of her hoodie sweatshirt. "That's right," she breathed. "And you?" "Tucker, the main mod from the paranormal enthusiast thread," he offered her. "You might recognize me as Krypton Tuck." Cindy relaxed a touch but did not step away from the open door of her car, which dinged obnoxiously with the still air. "Where's the rest of the team?" she asked, turning her neck as she analyzed every square inch of the moderately full parking lot. "No one else could make it, I'm afraid." He was still excited to enter the Angeles National Park at dusk, but he certainly didn't want to do it alone. "Oh," she responded doubtfully. "This place is creepier than I thought. I was really hoping for the whole group tonight." "I do understand your reservations, but you truly are in good hands." He indicated the military-grade backpack on his shoulders, which was modded out with a water bladder, a hatchet hanging from one of the straps. He thought the hatchet might scare her off even further, but to his relief, she closed the door behind her and stepped onto the nearest curb to measure herself in front of the entrance to the overgrown woods. There were no signs of playing children or masters and their dogs. It was just the two of them, and Tucker wasn't sure how he was supposed to feel either. There had been over 100 disappearances inside the Angeles National Park, also known as the Forest of Disappearing Children, and a few of those cases had been recorded that past summer. It had quite a history stretching back to the mid-70s, and its legacy was attached most unfortunately to that of a convicted serial killer that had been sentenced to death. Still, the children continued to disappear inside the woods, as late as 17 years old, and always children. This is, of course, what had attracted Tucker and Cindy to the paranormal enthusiast chat room, and there were more than a few enthusiasts right there in the Los Angeles area, so Tucker had offered a meet and greet to put a few faces to names and see what all the fuss was. Now, standing at the trail marker in front of the park's entrance, Tucker was glad he was 26 years old, much too old to be a child, he could only hope, but after running his eyes down from Cindy's thin beanie cap to her holey jeans, to her scuffed Converse shoes, he had to wonder if she was as safe as him. He didn't know how to venture to ask her her age without sounding like a total creep and pushing her further away. He didn't want to be alone, but he thought it was only fair to warn her about what she was getting into. She was a paranormal enthusiast after all. She had to know most of the story, right? "We better get going before it gets too dark," Tucker said. "I know there's a lookout point about a mile, but it's all uphill if you can manage." "I told the group we wouldn't go much farther than that," Tucker explained. "I brought a flashlight," she said, finally freeing a hand to show off the small handheld thing that could barely cast a beam 2 feet in front of her. "I thought the point was to go in after dark to get the whole experience," she continued. Tucker smirked, impressed now. He strapped a headlamp onto his own forehead and fixed the strap. "Yeah, we'll definitely have some time in the dark, but on our way down the hill. It'll be easier that way, and we won't have to spend too much time relying on our flashlights. Trust me, if you haven't been in the woods after dark, it gets really dark and disorienting." Cindy nodded seriously as they strode up the first stretch of path, side by side. Tucker switched on his headlamp to its lowest grade, just so they could feel more comfortable in the sudden shade that had fallen over them in the mixed mesh of redwoods and evergreen trees taking up space on either side of their trail. "I'm glad you know where you're going," Cindy said after an awkward pause that had stretched too long between them. Tucker had been in the process of thinking up a natural way to get her to confess her age, but was relieved to unwind in the break in silence afforded to them both. "Yeah, I've been on this particular trail a few times, always in the morning or afternoon, though, and never alone." "Ever come in here as a kid?" she asked. He nodded without her seeing. "A few times with friends after school. We knew about the stories then, too, of course, but that was all part of the allure." "You never saw anything? Never had a friend disappear?" Tucker wanted to laugh, but stifled it, thinking it would come across as too morbid. He didn't think he'd have to worry too much about that, as this was a girl who had seemed so giddy to ask him with an elevated tone and chin if any of his childhood friends had gone missing without a trace inside an infamously haunted forest. And hadn't her online handle been SlasherGirl666 or something to that effect? "No, I never saw anything strange, so that's why I wanted to come in at night, so maybe we could catch some of those orbs on camera, or with our own eyes. I hear groups have had luck attracting activity, and 2 people at least are better than 1. "What do you think the orbs are?" Cindy asked. She stepped aside, a bit breathless, Tucker noticed, to allow him to form the lead up the first hash-marked trail. "Some say they're the lost children, trying to find their way out of the woods," Tucker explained over his shoulder. He knew that his hatchet must seem intimidating, dangling in front of Cindy's face as she followed suit up the path. Others think the orbs are alien abductors that have snatched up the poor kids, looking to grab up some more. You think it may be alien abductions? He heard her ask behind him. There was a new edge to her voice, one of anxiety. He was at least thankful that he had taken the lead up the trail. It was his main intention to make her feel as safe and protected as possible, something he had developed from a lifetime caring for a younger sister, when they were both latchkey kids looking to fend for themselves after school in an empty house. As jumpy as she had already proved to be, if he had chosen to walk behind her, she would have probably already cut off the trail to slide down the hillside, back to the parking lot, abandoning Tucker to soldier the rest of the way himself. I don't like to speculate. I like evidence. I have a camera. If I see anything, I'll make a record. I'm just glad you have a weapon in case there really is a serial killer in these woods, she said, closer to his back than before. The trail leveled out a bit a few yards later, and they were able to stand shoulder to shoulder again as they walked, marching in the hush for a beat with only the crunching gravel under their shoes to keep their thoughts occupied. The headlight flickered out in the center of Tucker's forehead, and he cursed under his breath. For the first time, they could fully appreciate how murky the air had become with the setting sun. Cindy offered to switch on her keychain flashlight, but Tucker was already plopping his backpack onto the path and digging through its contents. He came back with a good-sized lantern that actually had a built-in TV screen and radio transmitter built into the body. The hand crank on the back told Cindy that it was rechargeable. "Get many TV channels out in the great outdoors?" Cindy asked with a smirk. Tucker smacked the lantern's body with his palm when it didn't turn on right away, and pointed a healthy beam out across the nearest gully and at a crop of trees beyond. No, not really. He was already set to continue up the incline laid out in front of them, but Cindy was still rooted to the side of the trail, staring out across the gully with her arms draped across her chest, and each hand clinging tightly to her bony shoulders. "Do you see that?" she suddenly snapped. Tucker jumped at her exclamation, and the high beam on his lantern danced as his head snapped up and around. He must have looked in every direction, probing the trees with his light, before finally centering on the crop of trees across the gully once again. "What? What do you see?" he cried. He narrowed his eyes and stooped down low next to her so he could center his light in the low brush at the base of the trees. She glared down at him with pleading eyes. "You're telling me you don't see those?" "See what?" he begged. "Something in the trees?" "No, it's the trees themselves. They're upside down. Don't you see the roots sticking up in the air?" Now he was studying her face, the beam still trained on the far-off clearing. Upside down trees? He looked again but only saw the usual backdrop of solid green evergreens, motionless in the calm night. She continued to stare off into space with wide eyes, sneering fearfully now. "And they're carved to look like devils, like totem poles, and they're painted with red or blood." "You're screwing with me now," Tucker said, but she threw him a distasteful look, already booking it down the path again. Whoa, wait, if you're going back, let me go with you," he called after her. She was quicker than he thought, scurrying and throwing the gravel in a flurry of dust and spraying rocks. "I don't need help from you. Listen, stop for a moment. My camera has a strong zoom. We can look at the trees up close if you want to. I'm sorry, my eyes aren't so good in the dark. Please wait." He was surprised when she froze in her tracks, leaning against a boulder and hyperventilating. He was quick to whip out a sweating water bottle from his pack, and she gratefully drank from it, her hand on her chest. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm sorry," she replied. "I don't mean to scare you, but I have hyperphantasia." "What phantasia?" Instead of being offended, she sighed. "I have a very active imagination. The things I see in my mind are so real sometimes. I think I might have been projecting those trees." "Like a hallucination?" "Uh-huh. I've been like this since I was 8. About 10 years ago." 18, Tucker thought to himself. 1 year older than the oldest child that had gone missing in the woods. "When I was a girl, I'd sometimes see red wolves in my living room, and I always thought they were protecting me somehow. They never attacked me." "Trippy," Tucker said. "Do you see them anymore?" "Sometimes," she answered quietly, without looking up from her sneakers. He wondered if she was afraid of looking up and seeing more of those totem poles lining the path. "Those trees were some of the scariest I've seen in a while, that's all. If you really didn't see them, I can't help but feel like I'm losing it." "That's such an interesting condition. I've never been able to picture anything in my head. I hardly ever dream, or even have an inner monologue." "You sound like you have aphantasia then," she said casually. "Huh, I didn't realize there was a name for it," Tucker said to himself. "I'm good to continue on But Cindy was cut off by a strange beep directly over their heads. They both exchanged a glance and seemed to be relieved that it hadn't been another hallucination. Tucker trained his beam on the top of the nearest redwood and saw a red light blink back at them from one of the tangle of branches. His first thought was that they were indeed encountering one of the famous orb lights, but the beep came again, fainter this time, and they could be sure it was from a piece of equipment fixed to the tree. In fact, it looked like a small satellite dish of some kind, and now that they had spotted it with their ears tuned toward the source, it seemed to emit a buzzing, humming noise, clearly active in transmitting something. If it hadn't been for the beep, they would have easily overlooked it, as it was painted in camouflage colors of brown and green. "What is that?" Cindy questioned. "I don't..." The milky gray TV screen built into the lantern flickered on with hissing static, and they both watched wide-eyed as images of children developed on the glass, all of them black-eyed, ashen-faced, and emotionless. What they were seeing was an aerial view of their very path, seemingly projected from the dish in the tree, and all around them were those black-eyed children, dressed in parkas, gym shorts, swimming trunks, and soiled tank tops. They were surrounding them, stepping out of the trees without making a noise, and staring at the two of them as they closed in. They weren't in a hurry, though, and they didn't seem to regard each other at all, sometimes bumping shoulders or tripping carelessly over roots in the ground without notice. They had their eyes set on the two of them, and them only. Tucker looked up from the screen but did not see anyone on the path. Cindy, however, was screaming and scrambling up the boulders behind him, reaching blindly for the lowest hanging branches to the oak tree. She dodged and ducked away from something unseen as she attempted to climb the tree, but the branches broke off in her hands and she was sliding backward into Tucker's arms. He caught her, but she fought him, knocking the lantern to the ground and scattering the light into the forest. She elbowed him, and he fell back against his pack, watching as she sprinted off the path and into the gully she would have avoided with her life only minutes ago. As he crawled toward the lantern, calling Cindy's name, he thought he saw her disappear into thin air, halfway across the clearing, the whites of her sneakers there one second and gone the next. He was too late in regaining control of the flashlight and shining his worthless signal into the ditch on the other side of the path. She was gone. Simply gone. He could even see the groove in the tall grass that she had carved in her escape, now completely devoid of woman or animal. The TV screen on his lantern was dead again, and he was at least thankful for that. He called her name again and listened intently after each bellow into the trees. After what seemed like his seventh call, he thought he heard something rustle in the brush behind him, too close for comfort. He searched every square inch of the path, but did not see any children or sign of their passage through the grass or footsteps in the dirt. He did see more of those satellite dishes, though, situated in about every third tree. That buzzing filled his skull for the second time, and he couldn't help but wonder what horrible images they were attempting to project into his head, and what horror Cindy must have seen after opening her susceptible mind to their frequencies. Thank God he had aphantasia, he thought to himself, and his hallucinations would remain exactly that, at least for the moment. That was when he decided it was time to go, but he shone one last beam into the clearing and thought he saw something red and furry skulking in the dead grass around the spot where Cindy had disappeared. The last thing he saw before he was sprinting down the path back toward the parking lot was the ginger-red tail of a fox cutting through the weeds and vegetation and whipping out of sight. As he huffed and cried on his mad sprint to his car, he heard the sorrowful howl of the wolves, mourning the loss of their lifelong protégé.
Too much sleep. Linda was over for her weekly visit at my cabin, her pant legs still wet from the long canoe ride, and we were trading ghost stories. Strangely enough, out of the hundreds of conversations we had shared there in my cabin, we had never tried to scare each other as we were, or even touched upon the spiritual realm. We usually just cooked food, talked about nature, listened to music on my transistor radio, or made love. Maybe there was something about that night, like a thickness, without a single breeze to scratch the branches outside, or an animal to grace the well-worn trails. Or maybe it was because the sun had set so quickly, and it was too dark for Linda to travel home. So we curled up on my grandpa's couch with the lights as dark as the windows, and we wondered what we should do. "That radio is a dinosaur," Linda said to me. She was right. Even a grizzly man, as Linda liked to call me, knew that the cinder block-sized contraption sitting on my shelf would be refused by any pawn shop, even if it was given away for free. "Did you know that they make radios now that are—" "Hey, that sounds like outside talk," I interrupted playfully. She laughed, but did not persist. She knew it was a lost cause with me. Sometimes she would come over and mention in passing something from the news, or a new technology that interested her, and I would always cut her short. 12 years ago I had left the world, to distance myself from those distractions, politics, money, technology. I wasn't that old of a man, only in my late 30s, and Linda was just a little older than me, old enough to understand my strange fascination with the wilderness and my reluctance toward society. The childhood summers at my grandpa's cabin were some of the happiest memories I still keep. Fishing in the lake, hiking up the hills, chasing squirrels up and down trees. He had built the cabin with his own hands, and then later settled there to live a life of simplicity, completely alone, yet content. After my grandpa had died 12 years ago, leaving the cabin in my nabe, I vowed that I would live comfortably self-reliant in the forest like him, growing my own food, hunting my own meat, and finally rejoining the nature I had been born into as a dandelion seed. If only that cold wind hadn't stolen me away and dropped me into an even colder world. I only kept the radio around for Linda, in case we wanted to listen to some music. Hell, I didn't even have power. The radio ran on batteries and the lamps in my cabin were oil. Still, she enjoyed visiting my cabin. She felt like she was going back in time whenever she stepped through my door. She was used to it by now. You see, whenever we met, she always crossed the lake to visit me, but I never crossed to visit her. She stopped trying to convince me to visit the town on the other side of the lake. Even though it only had a population of a few hundred people, I considered that town's civilization, the same civilization I had given up years ago. Linda was my final connection to the outside world, the one guilty pleasure I could not do without, even after all the things I had given up for the life in the wilderness. Although I forbade her from bringing her gadgets and her newspapers into my cabin, I loved to hear her speak. That night Linda stared longingly out the window, at the dark trees that appeared as cracks in the wall of the forest. She shivered to herself and I felt the aftershock up my own body. I can start a fire if you're cold, I told her. I reached over to brush the gray hairs away from her forehead. She looked at me with a set of deep green eyes, which I imagined had once been a stunning olive color in her youth. No, I'm not cold, she said. I just remembered an old story I once heard. It scared the hell out of me when I was a little girl. Maybe you've heard of it, the story of the Gaunt Man? Doesn't ring a bell. It's an old Japanese folk tale about a tall, spindly man that lives in the woods, disguised as one of the tallest trees. He only shows himself to children as they hike through the woods at night. He follows them home and steals their souls from their bodies as they sleep, and then traps them inside the trees for all eternity. Jesus, that's pretty grim, I said. The trees at night have always spooked me. I know it's ridiculous. I think my dad only told me the story so I wouldn't go outside at night, or else the Gaunt Man would come get me. I know I've heard a story like that, I said, trying to clear her mind. It plays off the belief that when we go to sleep, our spirit leaves our body to wander the earth. One day a man sat down under a tree in the forest to sleep, and he decided to leave his body to explore. When he returned to enter his body, it was missing. A deer came by and told him that a cougar had eaten him. The man's spirit entered the deer's body instead, and he lived for many years as an animal in the woods. Then one day his path crossed that of a cougar, and he ran into a lake to escape, but he drowned, or something. I can't really remember it now. What's the moral of that story? Linda asked with a laugh. Just because you can swim as a human doesn't mean you can swim as a deer, I offered her. It's about the only scary story I have. Linda tapped an elongated nail against her lip. She rested her head on my shoulder and tucked her legs under our blanket. I got another. I don't know where I heard it, but someone once told me that when you die you're visited by 3 spirits who judge your sins and prepare you for the afterlife. Like the ghosts of Christmas past? I laughed, but she was too consumed in her own thoughts to hear me. Wait, speaking of ghosts, I said, pushing up from the couch. She watched me with interest as I rooted around in an old bureau and returned with a faded Polaroid picture. I handed it to her and she squinted in the darkness. I brought over a lamp and we looked at it in the halo of light. In the picture, my father and his brother were inside the cabin, standing by the fire and holding the head of a deer up for the camera to see, their trophy from a day of hunting. Standing beside them was a faded image, blurred, yet still crisp enough to make out. I didn't even need to point out the period attire, the head, shoulder, and the clear facial features for her to see it was the transparent figure of a man. She gasped and looked at me in the eye. Is this my grandpa? I said. This picture was taken only days after he died. My dad and his brother came out here one weekend in his memory, and this is what they found, their father posing in the picture with them. Oh my God, that's so creepy, she blurted. I almost had to tear the picture out of her hand to return it to the drawer. Do you think he's still here? I looked around the living room as if expecting to find my grandpa leaning up against the fireplace. I don't know. I sense him sometimes, but that may be because all this stuff was once his, and it still holds his scent, his energy. If he was still here, you'd think he'd say hello sometime. A crack of lightning lit up the room, and we both jumped. We looked at each other with our hands on our hearts, smiling and breathing hard. She hurried to the window and looked outside. Already there was the pitter of pin and needle raindrops on the glass. She cursed and hurried to find her coat. "Whoa, I thought you were spending the night," I called after her. "I left all the windows open in my house. I didn't expect it to rain tonight," she said, opening my door. "And we both know when it rains here, it rains." I followed her outside with my collar turned up. We strode down the hill together and onto the wooden dock over the lake, now choppy with dark ripples of water. Linda's canoe bobbed in the surf, tied to a post with a length of rope. The rain was picking up now, and the clouds had covered the moon completely, snuffing out all natural light. We only had the soft haze of the houses on the other side of the lake, where people sat around electric TVs and glowing light bulbs. I had a flash of the first day I'd met her, there in the lake, right outside my front lawn. I was swimming and she happened by in her canoe. I remember coming to the surface near her boat, surprising her so much that she dropped her paddle. My face tensed with a smile, but then dropped again. I kissed her sadly and she sensed my distress. "Come across with me," she said. "Linda, you know I can't." "Come on. I can't walk home alone, not with all those dark trees. Who will protect me from the gaunt man?" She prodded me with a smile, and that smile was so lovely I swooned into her. "I don't know." She nodded her head, the raindrops trickling down the length of her bangs and the wrinkles on her face. She kissed me again and climbed into the canoe. Before she could go, I felt my body duplicate into two separate doubles. My double stepped out of my body as if it were only shrugging off a coat, and stepped into the canoe with Linda. She squealed happily and threw her arms around him. Both of them selected a paddle and set off across the dark lake, which might as well have been an ocean for me, standing on the dock, watching them go. This private island would be the death of me, surely. Too much sleep. Part 2. A week later, I was in the woods behind my cabin in the late afternoon, watching a deer through the telescopic lens of my rifle. I thought about Linda and the last time I had seen her, stepping into her canoe in the rain. I hadn't seen her since then. More than a week had passed and she had missed our date together. I had waited by the shore of the lake, hoping to catch a glimpse of her canoe, but it never came. What worried me was that she never missed a date. I couldn't call her because I didn't have a phone, and I wasn't about to paddle over to her side. Was she angry with me? Had something happened to her? I cursed myself for not getting into that canoe. It hadn't been the first opportunity I'd passed up. It used to be that my promise to my grandpa was enough of a conviction. The promise to take care of his cabin and live there for as long as I could. At the end of his life, he worried so much about his land, and it later became my major fear, a shared burden that was passed down for me to carry. To leave it for a day would be to abandon it, and with the abandonment of the cabin would be the abandonment of my duty. My isolation from society was nothing short of a sacred oath, like something a monk would devote his life to, knowing that it was for some greater good, not yet fully realized. If I was to cross that lake, it would be like undoing all the long years I had proudly carved into those cabin walls. It would be like a smoker disciplining himself for a decade and then suddenly giving in to temptation. After that, what is there? I had gone too far to give up now, and that was what killed my grandpa in the end. Once he had disciplined himself to the point of no return, his destiny was already sung, and when he did pass, he died in the upstairs bedroom of his cabin, without a single loved one at his bedside. As I held my rifle, I thought of my grandpa, and how he had first taught me to handle it, with the stock comfortably nestled against my shoulder. I sat on the upper bough of a tree with my legs dangling down, listening to the pops and cracks of an animal in motion. Then a deer strode into the clearing ever so carefully, a female doe, older, with a thick pelt and murky eyes. I watched the deer through my sight, counting my heartbeats. I held my breath and applied pressure to the trigger. I thought about the deer head from the ghost picture, and how Linda had responded to it, shaking excitedly like a child. The deer looked right up at me, and I choked on my breath. It didn't move. It just stared at me with those dark eyes. I knew that if I stayed comfortably still, it couldn't sense my presence. Then it spoke to me in a deep and raspy voice. "She's not coming back," the deer told me. I panicked and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the deer in the shoulder, and I watched its flesh ripple, as if a pebble had been thrown into a body of water. It collapsed to the grass without a sound. I didn't stop to gather the carcass. I didn't even look back at it. Jumping down from my perch, I sprinted back to my cabin and charged inside. With the gun still in my hand, I collapsed on the couch. I tossed it aside and it skated across the hardwood floor to rest by the hearth of the fireplace. I put my head in my hands and gulped for air as my world spun behind my eyelids. What I needed was a splash of cold water on my face, so I stood up to find the kitchen. The room spun and I caught myself against the dining room table. Right when my vision started to clear, I watched a man materialize at one of the chairs. Only a shadow at first, and then slowly gathering dimension and shape as though developing on a sheet of film. I jumped back with my heart seizing in my chest. It was my grandpa as a young man, as I remembered him from when I was a boy, and he was as solid as me. His blonde hair was slicked back and he wore a crisp vest over a red turtleneck sweater. He smiled at me brightly and offered me to sit with him. I plopped down hard into an open chair. "How are you doing, son?" He asked me with a voice that didn't quite match his lips. The voice sounded distant, as if it were underwater or imprisoned inside a seashell. "Gran?" I croaked, and he nodded his head. "Are you really here?" At this point, all feeling had trickled off my body to pool around my heels. "I've always been here," he said. "You have to cross the water. Nothing keeps you here, or me." "What are you saying?" "Sometimes we stray too far from our roots and can't go back. We all carry darkness with us, and hers ran deep. It's what carried me to this dark corner of the world, but I couldn't escape it. Not really. It's when we sleep too much and hold too fast to these dreams that we're not sure what's important anymore, what's truly real." Before I could speak, my grandpa was already fading out of existence. I watched him go and felt my energy return to my body. I bolted outside and looked out across the lake. Usually I could see the houses on the other side, but today they were obscured by a heavy mist over the surface of the water. I'd never seen anything like it in all my years at the cabin. I stood on the edge of the dock, wondering how I was going to get across. As if to answer my question, a lone canoe came drifting into view, empty and somewhat unsettling. It bumped with the dock, and I reached over to grab hold. I fell inside and struggled to right myself in the chaos of splashing water. I found a lone paddle and waded forward into open water, putting my grandpa's cabin at my back. I hadn't left my little island for 12 long years, but strangely enough, I didn't look back. Not that I could see anything in the thickening fog. I felt like I was out there for hours, which didn't seem right, judging by the size of the lake. I watched as the fog turned to a solid gray, and then into a black screen. The sun had left me with nothing but a chilled wind and a wet pair of pants, too cold for comfort. The lake was so still and quiet, I had never heard it that silent, not without the incessant chirping of the crickets. The dip of my paddle into the water hardly made a sound. I started to breathe through my mouth, just so I could hear something. Finally, the mist cleared and my canoe grinded with the shore. I fell onto cold grass and inhaled the night air. I looked up, and illuminated in the soft light of the moon was Linda's cottage, only a doll's house from where I was, but I knew it was hers. She had often pointed to it from across the lake, sometimes through a set of binoculars for a better look. The house with the red trim and the cherry tree in the yard. It was her favorite tree in the garden, she told me. A strange grove of trees separated me from the house, which I hadn't noticed before. I walked slow, watching as the naked trees scratched their branches together. Then I was right underneath them, their bodies nothing short of brick towers, and their arms like the complicated workings of a spider web, weaving and knitting into one collective canopy over my head. Then something moved to the left, while all the trees blew to the right. It appeared as only a crooked figure stepping out from behind one of the trees, and once it joined my path, I saw that this creature was all legs, and they were long. It moved toward me with the delicacy of a spider, another set of thin lines extending from its body in the shape of arms. Long, spindly fingers curled and uncurled within its hand. In the night, it was only a black figure, without any real substance, but I could see what appeared to be a roundish head set atop its twig of a body. I could see the reflection of light in its eyes, only dimes from where I was standing. I watched panic-stricken, rooted to the spot as the creature slinked toward me without ever making a sound. It stopped a few yards away, standing 15 feet tall at the least. its legs spread, and its arms hanging low to the ground, fingers curling and uncurling. It was hunched over, head bowed as if in prayer, and it stood perfectly still. One might have mistaken it for a tree growing out of the very path, if it hadn't spoken to me, of course. "We don't speak of such stories, not even when the trees are not themselves, when they are shadowed," the gaunt man said. His voice was but a whisper, a breathy exhale of air, which mimicked the sound of the wind in the trees. "Don't we know such stories act as prayers, drawing the darkness in rather than the light?" I had nothing to say. I stood below the creature, waiting for it to do something, anything. Even its fingers had stopped moving. I blinked my eyes for a few minutes, and the more moisture I brought to them, the more the creature resembled a tree in the middle of the path. After a while I realized that its spread legs were actually two different trees touching, and the arms were only low-hanging boughs with branch-like fingers. The head was nothing more than a knot in one of the trunks. I slowly navigated around the trees and ran the rest of the way to Linda's house. It was dark, and all the windows were closed. I ran past the cherry tree and into the house, skating up the stairs as if I was on a track. I passed through another door, and there was Linda, sleeping in her bed with the moonlight spilling in through the unshaded window, throwing crazy shadows across the ripples of her blankets. And I was lying in the bed with her, at least my body was, my arm around her waist. I looked at the window, and the pane of glass was still speckled with fresh rain. I hurried to Linda's bedside, my hands reaching out to touch her face, but passing right through. I saw that she wasn't breathing, and her skin was so pale, her mouth hanging slightly ajar. "I went home with her that night," I said out loud. "She didn't go out into the dark alone." My face filled with tears, and I didn't know if they were real or not. I wasn't even sure that the fingers that wiped them away were real. They felt solid. I kneeled by the side of her bed for some time, staring at Linda's vacant face. I wondered whether I should re-enter my body and try to shake her awake. I wondered whether I should call an ambulance or perform CPR, but I couldn't sense the slightest flicker of life in her face. I stood up and floated out through the window, hovering above Linda's tidy little garden and cherry tree. I was sad that I hadn't visited this garden earlier, that I hadn't helped her trim those hedges or plant those flowers into the soft soil. I was sad that I hadn't seen her at her best, happily standing below that tree, picking the cherries like candy, maybe saving a few for her pantry or popping a few into her mouth right then and there. Even though the wind had died down and the night had gone still, the cherry tree waved at me, its branches clicking against Linda's bedroom window. It seemed to groan at my presence, every bud and leaf on its body trembling with light. Light filled my senses, and I placed a hand on the trunk, so warm to the touch. I felt her stir inside her earthly shell, her voice coming to meet me across a long distance. I smiled and pressed my face against the bark, feeling her lips kiss my cheek. Something insisted on rooting me to this world, at least for a little while longer. Everything I needed was there in nature, only not in the nature I had always envisioned on my distant island, forever swimming in the lake and chasing squirrels. I found everything in the warm embrace of a cherry tree, in the rain-soaked garden of my deceased love. And to think a town was right there at my back, where people still shopped in stores and woke up to the morning news. It had been there all along, and just like my grandpa in his cabin long faded on a crumpled Polaroid, so had I.
Bloody Mary, I have your child. That crisp December 5th saw a slight turn in the weather. Icicles were melting and the snowmen were sinking. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and kids were home from school, and parents were plopping down in their sofas and chairs. The police weren't relaxing, though, especially not Officer Robert Downs and Donald Lawrence. They had been to the Jacobs household the previous week to see about asking questions about the disturbance at Penny Lane with the vandalized fence. The father, Mr. Jacobs, informed the officers that Mary and Caitlin Jacobs had been asleep the whole time. The two police thanked the man for his time and continued on their way. The next morning they returned to the Blue Log Circle off of Penny Lane and took another look at what was left behind in Miss Delores' front and back lawns. Robert Downs dragged his foot through the fresh snow of last night. He paused. The sleeve of a jacket was sticking out of the white powder. He considered it for a moment as he carefully lifted it out of the snow. It was a heavy ski jacket. He brushed it softly and inspected his find. "Don, come here for a sec," he said to his partner. "Take a look at this." He handed Don the jacket and he looked at it with interest. "There's a rip in this jacket, almost as if it's been stabbed," Robert finished. "So what does this mean?" Donald asked, holding the jacket outwards. Robert did not answer. Donald turned the coat over and looked into the inner lining. On the tag was scribbled, "Mary Jacobs." Don's mouth fell open and he pointed this out to Robert. Rob took it and held it out in front of him. He peered down the street where he could just see the Jacobs house inside the cul-de-sac. "Well, let's get our facts straight," said Robert. Not long after this, the two policemen were on the porch of the house. No answer. The family was away. When the two men were about to turn away, the front door opened. They stood there for a few seconds waiting for someone to come out from behind the door and greet them, but no one did. "Hello?" Rob asked. He stepped forward, pushing the door open a bit more. The inside of the house was revealed, empty and silent. Rob put his hand to his gun and gave Donald a look of alert caution. Donald nodded, his hand at his own hip. Robert stepped inside the house, his gun loosely held out in front of him. Donald followed. "Is anyone here?" Ronald asked. He knew no one was, though. But how could the front door just swing open like that? Rob took a look at the door and saw that it had been unlocked. Usually when people leave, they lock the front door. Sometimes owners forget, but Rob tried to think if he had heard the lock click before the door opened. Had he? He could have. His hearing wasn't as reliable as it used to be. "Don, I'm not liking the look of this," Robert whispered over at him. Don gulped and carefully cocked his handgun. "Any sign of foul play?" he asked. Robert looked around the house quickly. "No," he said simply. Then a cry of pure pain broke through the silence. It was the voice of a woman. It was the cry of despair and anguish. This person sounded as if she had been wounded, and it came from directly under their feet. The basement. The cry came again, followed by something that sounded like a piece of furniture toppling over. The cops sprinted forward, searching every door they came to. They found the basement door in a matter of seconds and were bounding down the stairs. Robert yelled for the woman. Don screamed for anyone else to put their hands up. "Ma'am, are you okay? Hands above your head!" Once they had entered the cold basement, they saw nothing but old boxes and one unused treadmill. There was no distressed woman or anything of that nature. There was, though, not more than a few yards away, an old trunk which looked like it belonged to a circus years ago to carry costumes and props. It was turned on its side and looked like it had rolled a few feet forwards. That must have been the large bang they had heard from upstairs. "That's a huge chest," Don exclaimed. He lowered his gun. Robert snapped his head around, but did not see any sign of anybody. He did not lower his gun, though. He strode over to the trunk and prodded it with the toe of his shoe. The trunk was big enough to hold a person. Maybe that was the source of the disturbance. "Can anyone hear me?" Robert asked. "Robert, you think there's someone in there?" Don asked, astonished. "That's exactly what I'm thinking." He kicked the trunk harder this time. That's when it rocked upwards and slammed Rob in the shins. He screamed out and fell on his back, the gun bouncing away. Donald sprang forward to help Robert, but the trunk twirled around like a top. The corner of its base caught Don in the backside of his thigh. He lost his footing and did the splits right there on the concrete. His knee smashed into it, and the muscle in his groin twisted into a knot. The trunk rear-ended Robert in the lower body before it bounded backwards again. Robert screamed again, reaching out for his partner. Donald got onto his hands and knees and had time to see what looked like a hand shoot out from the trunk's interior. But this hand did not break through. It went through it. It was translucent, too, and blurry. Another hand came into view, and what Donald thought was the beginnings of a head. It was hard to make out, but he could see two glazed eyes. No mouth, but there was more blood running down the lucid features. Robert got to his feet and hobbled over towards Don's resting place. Donald looked up, stunned, his hands compressed against his sore leg. His eyes were glued to the ghostly figure that was emerging from the trunk. Robert grabbed Donald by his arm and pulled him up against the solid concrete wall. The figure was now up out of the trunk and was standing next to it. Rob looked back at a woman who hovered above the ground, with no legs, no real clothing, but he could see her arms held out at her sides. The one thing that looked unmistakable and solid was a scepter of some kind, held in one of her hands. It was sculpted from gold to look like a serpent, with jewels and diamonds encrusted on the outside. She just stood there for a few seconds before, out of the open serpent's mouth, a long double-edged blade slid, which was already blood-stained and rusted. The thing laughed wickedly. Robert moved fast and snatched Don's gun from the ground. He knew that it was no good, but he fired once through the figure, making dust of the back wall. Robert was hysterical now. He was about to fire again, but the woman appeared at Rob's feet and detached his hands from his arms in one long sweep.
Robert screamed and was thrust backwards into Donald, sending them both into a dusty heap on the ground. Blood covered them both as the ghost woman loomed over them, her cold eyes laughing and mocking. She struck and sank the blade into Robert's chest, killing him instantly. Donald screeched and pushed his partner off of him. He quickly got to his feet and darted up the stairs with much effort. He could hear a woman cry out with glee, and the tread of footsteps on the steps behind him. Don screamed as he stumbled forwards onto his chest and knees. Behind him, hard laughter followed his temporarily grounded body. He scrambled up the steps. He was panting desperately, his hands reaching out at the stairs. His arm muscles helped to pull up his dead weight towards the open doorway ahead. Donald's fingers were right at the landing of the upstairs when a cold hand came through his uniform and dug into the top of his back. He howled in pain as the hand recoiled, pulling Donald backwards. He twirled his arms around in circles, trying to catch his balance, but he was gone. He tumbled back down the splintered steps, his head cracking into the wall, shoulders separating under impact, and his arm and one of his wrists snapped like twigs. On his way down, he fell through the woman, and before he died, he felt ice-cold life and death crawl into his veins and organs. Propped up against the last stair, and the bottom landing was the scepter, its blade setting perpendicular for Donald. He had enough time to see it sitting there, the snake's eyes laughing and egging him on. He stuck out his elbows and kicked off at the stairs. He soared over the last few steps, but as he landed next to the dead Robert at the bottom, in a puddle of blood, his foot caught the handle of the cane and it twirled upwards into the air. Donald groaned, his head trying to raise upwards. His whole world was spinning now, and he could see a blue wisp of a woman standing in the stairwell, cold, dead eyes staring directly at Don's twisted, aching body. His head fell back onto the concrete. That's when he saw the falling cane impale into his hip. He screamed again, closing his eyes tight. Tears rolled down his chubby cheeks. When he opened his eyes again, the woman's featureless face was millimeters away. All he could see were her blank eyes, full of pain and hate. They seemed to scream out at him, cursing and mocking him. All of these mixed emotions rang inside his head after staring into those eyes. He spasmed forcefully with a serious heart attack. He twisted into a frozen knot, his eyes glassy and perplexed. His mouth was sculpted in mid-scream, his arms out in front of him, fingers gnarled. The woman simply evaporated into the air. Mrs. Norris peered outside her window around 5 o'clock to see a police car moving slowly down the road. Inside, a policeman, whose mouth and eyes were open widely, glared out of the window with a pained expression. He did not blink or move. It was like he was frozen. In the driver's seat, there was an officer who was hunched forward, his eyes closed and his hands missing from the wheel. This was very odd, but the car was driving, so there couldn't be too much wrong. Maybe he was searching blindly for something on the ground. He'd get his hands back on the wheel soon. She went away from the window, and she did not see the police car ride smoothly off the small, cracked road and onto the lake beach. It rode smoothly across the sand, past houses' backyards until it slowly drove into the lake. It treaded water until it was about 10 yards out. It sank downwards in a small spray of foam, leaving only a few bubbles to decorate the water's surface. If Mrs. Norris had checked the lake, she would have seen the Buick sitting at the bottom, quickly gathering rust. Inside, 2 dead bodies hovered loosely above their seats. One would have missing hands. If Mrs. Norris had looked out of her window again, she would have seen a blurry sequent woman emerge slowly out of the water. Once on the beach, she would just fade away, taking the tire treads in the sand with her. But she left her footprints behind, which one neighbor noticed and pondered over. They were from the lake and seemed to vanish. She didn't seem to think much about it. From the school to Mary's house was a total of 17 minutes, so the bike ride wasn't very comfortable, due to the amount of seating each person had. Mary shuddered when she looked up at her house, because it was like looking at the face of an ugly mask. "Come on," Mary said, getting off the bike and proceeding into the house. Will and her sister Katie followed, both confused and scared. Katie at least knew what Mary was planning to do, but Will was left in the dark about the whole thing. Mary strode up the stairs, headed straight toward the open door of her bedroom. Will followed close behind, Katie in the rear. Mary took a deep cleansing breath and poked her head inside the room. She gasped and pulled back out into the hall beside her boyfriend. "It's back on the wall, even after I locked it up," Mary whispered to Katie. At that, Katie began to shake. "Get the hammer. I left it in the basement, by the trunk." Katie nodded and took off down the stairs. Will looked over into Mary's face. "What's on your wall?" Will asked. "Are you talking about that creepy trunk in your basement? Did your family finally get it open?" Mary didn't answer.
She proceeded back into her room and noticed how freezing cold it was. A huge plume of her breath burst out in front of her. She covered her arms and sat down on her bed, facing the horrid mirror. "It's freezing in here," Will pointed out as he stepped inside the room. Katie stepped inside after him, the hammer held out like a baton. She also commented on the room's temperature before handing the hammer over to her sister. Mary lifted the hammer and stepped toward the mirror slowly. "Mary, what are you—" She moaned as the mirror fogged over as if 10 people had just breathed on the surface all at once, which caused Will and Katie to cower by the door. The mirror then started to hum and vibrate. On the glass, the darkness broke apart and revealed Will's reflection standing there in Mary's room, staring distantly at Mary. The mirror version of Will suddenly screamed as a long, rusty blade came into view and sliced down his forehead to his neck. He screeched as blood flew every which way, one of his eyes popping out of his socket. Blood now was starting to spray at the glass, splattering Mary's carpet and jeans. She screamed hoarsely, wiping blood away from her, but it only existed in the mirror. Will slid down the wall, leaving a streak of fresh blood. Now Katie came into frame. The same blades stabbed at her and caught her between the shoulder blades and reeled her backward. A blue hand reached out and grabbed her by the hair. The blade then came down in a shower of blood. Mary shook off the distractions. She got to her feet and raised the hammer. By the time the tool was descending towards the glass, her sister was flailing around on the floor, the blade stabbing into her stomach inside the mirror. Mary screamed her tonsils out as the hammer hit the glass and spread a large spiderweb crack across it. Off in the distance, they could hear a woman screaming out in pain. She brought the hammer back down into the mirror, breaking it off of the wall. She got down onto her hands and knees and made sure all of the large pieces had been reduced to gravel. The woman had stopped screaming, and by the time Mary brought the hammer down again, for the final time, they sat in silence. She dropped the tool and fell back onto her bed, tears rolling down her cheeks. Then Will flipped the light switch, and that's when everything came into perspective. The shards of glass were still there, and they noticed the large hole in the wall for the first time. The next day, after school, Mary did just as Miranda planned. She stayed behind to make up for a test she had missed, while Miranda and a couple of her friends broke away from the gym to roam the empty halls. Miranda circled around the history class several times, her hawk eyes plastered on the classroom door. "You remember your job, don't you?" Miranda asked her blonde friend. "I remember." Miranda smirked. She circled some more around the closed history room like a vulture as her friend prepped herself. The door swung open and Mary strode out. Katie had walked home so Mary could use her car. She pulled her keys from her tight jeans and proceeded down the hall. Outside it began to snow hard, which made Mary smile even more. She loved the snow because it only meant the holidays were closing in. From one of the classroom pods to Mary's right came the cheerleader blonde. She held a glass of red fruit punch in her hand. Mary didn't see the girl rush at her from the side and collide into her. The bright red punch catapulted at Mary's temple and soaked her face and hair in a sticky substance. Mary screeched and dropped her book bag. The blonde gave a sarcastic "sorry" and pulled back into the pod where her friends awaited her. "You're kidding me," Mary blurted, watching the cheerleader go. She shook off the liquid and started towards the restroom to clean herself off. When Mary disappeared behind the girls' room door, Miranda came out from her hiding place, ready to do her damage. Mary cupped her hands under the icy cooled water in the sink and did her best to cleanse the sticky mess off of her. She dried her face and tried to fix her hair, but soon gave up. She'd be heading home soon, so what did it matter? Miranda came in after her. Her thumbs twiddled at the end of her short cheerleader skirt. She whined helplessly, tossing back her hair with a click of her neck. Mary turned towards her and automatically gathered up her stuff, trying for the door. "Mary, please!" Miranda whined again, backing up against the restroom door. "What do you want, Miranda?" Mary prodded. "I have to talk to you. You know about Bloody Mary. Well, I did the chant thing last night and—" "Ha ha, Miranda, I get it," Mary said smugly. "I'm afraid of ghosts, right?" Mary tried one last time to push toward the door. "No, I don't joke this time. I did the chant, I saw her in the mirror, and I ran." Miranda started to fake cry, banging her forehead with her palms. "You're kidding. I don't know why I did it. I was just skeptical about the whole thing. I did it as a joke, but I know you were afraid of her, so I—" "Come on," Mary huffed. "All I did was say Bloody Mary 1, Bloody Mary 2, Miranda began. Bloody Mary 3, Bloody Mary 4. "Okay, Miranda, I know how it goes." Miranda slid the doorstop into the door jamb with the side of her sneaker. The other hand reached for the light switch behind her. "Bloody Mary 5, Bloody Mary 6, Bloody Mary 7.
Mary wrenched away from her and looked into her own reflection in the restroom mirror, then back at Miranda, who was grinning ear to ear. She was no longer crying when she switched the lights off. Bloody Mary 8. Miranda, this isn't funny, Mary moaned, reaching around the sinks. You don't know what you're doing. Bloody Mary 9. Don't! Mary stumbled toward Miranda's outline in front of her, but caught her foot around the backpack strap. She fell forwards into the sink, but was able to catch herself. Miranda! Bloody Mary 10! Miranda cackled. Bloody Mary, I have your child! Mary screamed. Miranda gracefully circled around Mary until she was standing right next to the sink. You baby! Miranda threw back her head and laughed. So where is she, huh? Mary scrambled forwards and ran through the darkness, forgetting her stuff. She struck the door with her shoulder and turned the knob, but it was locked. How? Mary's foot kicked at the bottom of the door and found there was a doorstop wedged in the jamb. Mary fell to her knees and tried to unjam the doorstop. That's when Mary heard the distinct sound of cracking glass over her shoulders. Miranda stopped laughing, but Mary continued to try to dig the doorstop out from the crack. What was that, Jacobs? Miranda asked desperately. They heard dripping from the mirror, then running liquid, coursing down the wall-length mirror. It soon sounded like a fountain was in the room. Miranda screamed out in surprise as the dripping grew and grew until it sounded like they were in a waterfall. It started to cover the floor and Mary could feel it pooling around her knees. Mary tried to dig the doorstop out, but her arm muscles felt knotted up, and her sweaty fingers slipped off the rubber item. She then started to cry along with Miranda. What is this? What are you doing, Jacobs? She moaned. The rushing water stopped. Silence consumed the two girls until something was wading through the liquid, stepping towards them from one of the stalls. Mary heard the stall door swing open and clack into the wall. Footsteps came closer and closer. Is that you, Jacobs? Miranda whispered in stone-cold fear. No. Then Miranda screamed out for half a second before something sliced through the air and something else that sounded like 10 pounds of meat plopped into the water. Mary spun around and almost fainted at what she saw. A blue woman held Miranda up into the air by her neck. Miranda thrashed around, but her mouth was stifled by the enormous amount of blood, so she couldn't scream. Her arm was laying next to the ghost woman's foot. Mary tried to shut her eyes, but couldn't. This was the first time she had seen Bloody Mary up close and personal. The woman had cold fishbowl eyes with milky white pupils. Her face was purple and pussy, her caterpillar lips pulled back to show yellow rotting teeth. The cobra scepter Mary had seen in the mirror was sticking into the tiled floor. Miranda was thrown backwards into the bloody mirror, smashing it to thousands of glass shards, which scattered around Mary's huddled body. Bloody Mary once again picked up Miranda and set her neatly atop the sink. The scepter appeared in her hand. Her other bloated palm struck Miranda across the cheek, instantly waking the girl. Miranda choked, and even through the dark, Mary could see her look over at her with pleading eyes and a quivering lip. This only made the ghost woman smile even wider, as the bladed scepter connected with Miranda's gut. Mary tried to scream but could only fall back into the door behind her, eyes glued to the glowing ghost, no more than 10 feet away. With the blade inside Miranda, Bloody Mary lifted the rag doll body up over her head and slung her backwards into the open stall. Inside, Mary heard the porcelain toilet reduced to rubble and the spray of fresh water. Mary turned back to her work and wrenched the doorstop out from the jamb with the remainder of her strength. She tossed it over her shoulder and turned for a moment so that she could get to her feet. She screamed because Bloody Mary's face was inches from her own. The decaying nose hissed like a squeaky squeeze toy as the ghost breathed. The rotten, rancid mouth was open before Mary, the pink tongue lifeless and useless. Her eye lolled back and forth as the other was rooted inside its socket. Blood ran down from it like tears. In a distant voice, which didn't seem to come from the moving mouth, Bloody Mary spoke to Mary. I'll see you at home, Bloody Mary said simply. Mary wasn't going to wait for another second. She plowed through the door and through the empty halls. She sprinted through the fresh snow and fumbled with her keys. Once inside her car, she fell over the steering wheel and sobbed, her heart beating alarmingly fast. A soaking wet Mary tripped inside her house, her heart still beating, her hands shaking. She knew what the ghostly apparition had meant. She leapt up the stairs 3 at a time as the family came through the kitchen to welcome her. Had she really thought it was over? Mary stepped inside her bedroom, and her breath plumed out in front of her. She gasped, because there on her wall hung Bloody Mary's mirror, perfectly new and clean. She could see bloody footprints on the carpet leading back to Mary's bed from the mirror. On the bed was Mary's book bag, which she had left behind in the girls' room back at school. It was zipped up and nicely buckled. Katie followed Mary and stepped up next to her. She too gasped when she saw that the mirror was back. Mary? The mirror? Katie began. No. It's not just a mirror, Mary whispered. Girls, is everything okay? Mr. Jacobs called from the bottom of the stairs. The girls didn't answer.
I wouldn't open it if I were you. At 9 p.m. at night, the 44-year-old Nigerian woman who called herself Margaret logged into her instant messenger to communicate with the U.S. resident Nathan for the last time. At least that is what she hoped. It had been a long 3 months stringing the unwitting victim along in her phishing scam, forming a long-distance relationship with him, telling him everything he wanted to hear, claiming to be a Christian, telling him she loved him and how much she wanted to have his baby, and making plans to visit him at his residence in California. Of course, he didn't know that she lived in Nigeria. He thought she was a 29-year-old white girl in Texas living in her late dad's house with no friends or family of her own. She had planted the seed early on in their relationship that she was planning to travel to Dubai soon to clear up all tax documents for his inheritance. She had forged all the documents, of course, to show Nathan through digital pictures in the messenger. All were part of a careful formula to build up a sense of false confidence in her mark before driving the hook in with the devastating news that she was locked out of her bank account. He would need to send her cryptocurrency in the total of $15,000 to pay off the taxes for the inheritance and for a flight ticket back to his house. He fell for it all swimmingly, and when she flipped the script a second time, claiming that she would have to stay an extra week to fulfill a biometrics check, he became hesitant to send her any more money as she had already drained his savings. She relaxed her stranglehold around him with the news that her dad's associates in the UK would be sending him a package containing jewelry and cash totaling $800,000. He was happy to receive the package, but with the news that it had been held up in customs, he began to panic visibly in the instant messenger chat. She assured him that he would only need to pay the fee of $700 to the fraudulent shipping site she provided, and then the package would be released to him. He reluctantly paid the final amount, claiming that was all he had left in his bank account. And she had no reason to doubt this, judging by his increasing desperation in his replies. Now, after claiming all of his money, she was sure that she would open the messenger to see all of his last messages, begging for her response and explanation regarding the package that would never come. Of course, she wouldn't respond to him. There would be no reason. Opening the messenger, she grinned in the bright blue light with the confirmation that there was indeed a response. It was multifaceted, though, and it consisted of a list of 5 items. It read as follows. 1. When you find yourself sweeping up at night, the dust you choke on will be my ashes. 2. The next time you bump your left leg into something you can't see, that will be my impenetrable ghost. 3. The next time you find yourself whistling at night, the responding voice you hear will be my death rattle. 4. And that unknown caller calling your phone, don't answer it because that's me contacting you from hell. 5. And the package that never arrived, when it appears on your doorstep, I wouldn't open it if I were you. Allayé, darling. She turned off her computer instantly with a shiver running across her spine, surprised at how personal the message had struck her. As a southern Nigerian woman, an Igbo, she had been raised with all 4 of these superstitions drilled into her young, malleable mind. No Nigerian worth her salt would ever risk sweeping up or whistling at night. Bumping her left leg and answering a phone from an unknown caller were other well-known urban legends that her late father had always insisted to be a set of rules of the house that she should never do. What struck the hardest was the final sign-off, Allayé, darling, which any Nigerian scammer knew was the code word that could be used between 2 fake profiles on the internet to signify that they were both on the same side. It referred to a hooligan or street-smart individual among the Igbo people. How had he learned she was Nigerian, and specifically an Igbo? She knew from her father, long since passed, that betraying any of these superstitions would result in attracting a vengeful ghost to her doorstep. Was this his final suicide note to the woman who betrayed him? She tried her best to shake off the sudden pregnant silence that had infected her townhouse. Her pit bull whined from the corner, looking at her with a cocked head. He could tell that something was unsettling her, and she forced a smile, which was quickly met with an excited wag of his tail. She patted him on the head, but that did little to relax the tightly strained muscles in his back or in her own. A light flickered in the kitchen, and she and her dog glanced into the next room doubtfully. Never fear, she told her dog in English. He's only trying to scare us. Never in her decade of hooking and exploiting poor rich men, she had never caused them to commit suicide, as far as she knew. Most of the final messages ended with a string of bad words telling her to rot in hell or with threats that they were calling the police. But nothing had ever hit as hard as Nathan's final message. Her dog howled and she jumped until her skull hit the dormant fan blade above her head when the crystal vase toppled off the mantel and shattered on the hearth of the fire. The room fell still again. Not even the dog whined. He didn't move from her side, as frozen as her. Still, she managed to laugh, and she instinctively reached for the broom in the closet. She caught herself, and she could see her father's pained expression in her mind's eye, warning her to hold off. She shook her head at the image, dismissing the silliness of it all. She approached the bits of crystal with the broom and dustpan in hand, and she began to sweep up the mess. Her father was shaking his downcast head in her mind, but she had already completed the task, unaware that she had been holding her breath the entire time. Once she caught herself, she took a deep breath and choked on something solid and gritty, like dirty fingers being shoved down her throat. She choked and doubled over, and her dog rushed to her side, pressing his wet nose against her left leg. Whatever it was, she coughed it up, and her dog sniffed the black sludge that she had spit across her hardwood floor. "The dust you choke on will be my ashes." She rushed to the door of her townhouse, hoping to poke her head outside to suck up as much fresh air as she could, her dog trailing behind her and barking, and she met an unstoppable force that knocked the already scarce wind out of her chest and swept her feet out from under her. Her dog continued to bark at the invisible wall that she had met with, and all she could do was curl into a ball on the floor and cradle the bruise on her left leg that smarted the most. Nothing moved in the house, but her pit bull still jumped back with such alarm that she had to stare into the empty space directly in front of them, guarding her most injured parts of herself in case the obstacle chose to rush toward them. Whatever was there, she could sense it, like that feeling of sitting in a classroom and squirming under that itching feeling of eyes on you. She watched the blue and black bruise forming on her upper thigh, the blood vessels bursting before her eyes. And whatever it was, her dog could see it, and it was howling now, bouncing up and down on his 4 paws and rushing from one end of the room to the other. "And the next time you bump your left leg into something you can't see, that'll be my impenetrable ghost." Still, she couldn't move. She thought she could hear something breathing in that empty spot, a ragged paper bag in the wind. And once her mind returned to the 3rd number on the list, her front door banged open in the same wind that she had imagined blowing through her living room, and her dog was already bolting for the open night. This time she moved, reaching after him and barely grazing his tail as he disappeared through the void of a doorway. She whistled after him, knowing this was the only loud, pitched noise he would answer to. And she hacked out her lung again, realizing with mounting horror that she had just fulfilled the 3rd curse. "The responding voice will be my death rattle." And the gasping, tearing, diseased moan that she heard rolling through the hills outside her house and penetrating through her banging door prickled the eardrums in her head to such a degree that she clapped her hands over both sides of her temple and crawled toward the wind tunnel to slam the door, forgetting her dog for the moment, just in time to hear the ringtone on her cell phone, an ominous, echoing ding of a bell that reminded her for the first time of something a church tower would clang out on the morning of a funeral. She didn't have to peek at the screen to see the unknown caller tag, and she felt her gut slip down a few levels in her lower body, and her legs gave out under her once again. Her knees smashed against the hardwood, and her palms slipped for purchase as her entire world spun. "Don't answer," she heard her father say in her ear. "Never answer." But a steely part of herself needed to know, demanded to know, and she reached up blindly toward the table above her head, her fingers slipping and fumbling to catch on the vibrating and tolling piece of plastic. But the call ended before she could bring the phone to her ear, and she was already thinking about dialing *69 to see where the call might take her. But everything was still again, and she could only think about the final curse. The package would arrive on her door, but she had already just had her door open. She had watched her dog breeze past the porch without jumping over any obstructions, and she certainly hadn't noticed anything by the door after just slamming it. But had she really looked that closely? Could she bring herself to ever leave her house again and risk hearing that howl, which seemed to have risen from the very earth, to worm itself into her ears like so many splinters in her mind? And why did the voice sound so familiar? Again, she saw her dead father frowning in her mind, and she knew that he wasn't happy to have been used as a tool in her illegal exploits. She never thought he would have approved, but it was his fault for leaving her when she was so young. He was the one who had to die in that car accident and leave her orphaned in a cold and unforgiving world. In the Child Protective Services of Nigeria, where older men had abused her. It was his fault. His! She screamed as she ripped open the door, challenging the specter to meet her, and she was not disappointed. There was the package that had never existed, that she had never sent to the pitiful Californian Christian man, who had only wanted to share his life and his savings with the right woman. There were no marks on the box at all, which was as big as a toaster, and there was no tape securing the flaps. Another wind came through, causing the cardboard lips to twitch ever so slightly, scowling and then smirking at her. "I wouldn't open it if I were you," she heard a male voice say inside her mind, and she dove into the box, ripping open the flaps and screaming until the surrounding hills had swallowed her voice and sucked it from her lungs, to bury her essence in the dirt with the rest of the ghosts of living beings she had corrupted, smashed, and scattered to the unholy wind. The echo of her stolen voice bounced back to her and said one word, "Daddy?" And her eyes crossed at the horrific clown grin beaming at her from the dead mouth inside the box, and she was falling again, toppling through space and into the open box, face to face, lip to lip with the graveyard mouth. And the dripping, brittle claws were grappling with her now, and they dragged what remained of her into the open hole in her porch, spinning and thrashing through open space and fire. The whole way down she heard her forever lover calling her name, punctuated with a breathy, "Allez, darling." The haunting is hers. He knew the house to be empty, at least that is what he thought. He would stand there in his garage, softly sponging his car and dripping streaks of suds. It had that empty quality, that much he could say. The windows looked so vacant because of the absence of curtains. The lawn was so unattended, weeds growing freely like reaching fingers. No one came to tend the garden, not anymore, from what he could see. The for sale sign had been there for almost a year, standing askew in the mesh of weeds. He remembered the former owners of the house, a nice man and his son. The man had been bald, with a bulging stomach. He was kind, he remembered. Frank was his name, he thought from inside his garage, a pool of water collecting around his sandals. Frank had kept good care of his lawn, always mowing and tending after it. His son was always gone, doing whatever teens like to do. The son would crank up the radio of his Jeep to full blast as he sped away, his father dryly waving after him. "Frank did take care of that lawn," he said distantly, scanning the length of the unkept grass by the front door with his eyes. He recalled Frank fertilizing the lawn himself and planting flowers nearest the front porch. He would water them constantly and would trim the plants that were growing too fast for his liking. He would get down on his hands and knees, plucking the dandelions with his plump fingers. He would go through his normal routine of yard work and then stop. He would either just stand there by the side of his house or sit on the porch in a glider. He would stare out into nowhere, sometimes smoking a cigarette or eating a sandwich. "That man really loved his yard," Ben muttered. He gave the empty house one last look, almost expecting to see Frank standing by the side of his yard, hands on his hips. Why didn't he go into his house after finishing all those chores? Ben thought to himself. Why did he never leave the vicinity of his lawn? Come to think of it, any time Ben saw Frank, he was always outside working on the lawn, going through the regular routine. After mowing, watering, and weed picking, he'd still stay outside. He would stare up into the sky as if he were studying a flock of birds. Ben had talked to him only once, and he had seemed normal enough, back when Ben's wife was still alive. They went over to visit Frank when he first moved in. His son was hauling a set of dresser drawers. His long blonde hair covered his face like a screen, but the boy managed to guide himself into the house. Frank was standing in the lawn, barefoot, and clutching a shovel. He noticed Ben and his wife and waved. "Frank Donahue, nice to meet you too," Frank said. That had thrown Ben off. It was like he didn't even have to introduce himself. The new neighbor had already done all the talking. "I'm Ben, and this is my wife Angela," Ben said, shaking Frank's sweaty palm. Angie did the same. "We live across the street, right over there," Angie explained, gesturing toward the correct house. Nice neighborhood? Frank asked, turning his attention back to the lawn. Oh, yes, Angie replied, giving Ben a side glance. Frank then fell on his knees in the grass, both hands pressing against the earth. Does this yard feel a little lumpy to you? He asked, giving them both a crooked grin. I don't. Never mind, Frank snapped, cutting Angie off. He got back to his feet with a loud grunt. Who owned the house before? Frank asked, clutching his shovel again. A nice couple, Angie said, clearing her throat. She gave Ben another look. They had a nice young daughter, Ben added, ignoring Angie's stare. There was a misunderstanding, Angie interrupted, elbowing Ben. Frank seemed to wince at this. He stabbed the blade of the shovel into the lawn. He turned his bald head slowly to Angie. His brown eyes resembled two black holes. A misunderstanding? Well, Angie began, it was an accident. She glowered at Ben, running her fingertips across her brunette bangs. Ben figured Frank needed to know, or at least had a right to know. Their daughter disappeared, Ben concluded. Right after she went missing, the couple moved out and split up from there. How is that a misunderstanding? Frank asked. Angie seemed to blush there on Frank's driveway as Ben stood idly by her. I don't believe the girl's parents were good people. I saw them together. They were terrible to each other. They shouted a lot and touched their daughter. Touch her? Frank said. Like pushing her or pulling her really hard out the door of their car. Stuff like that, Ben explained. She was only 9. I always wanted to say something. That doesn't prove that the parents had something to do with their disappearance, Frank advised. There was a bang as the teenage boy reappeared on the porch. He now had his hair pulled back from his forehead, revealing a handsome young man, maybe around 17. Jason, say hello to Ben and Angie, Frank called over to his son. Hello, Jason said simply, before bending down over a hefty box by the door. He hauled it inside before slamming the door shut. Teenagers, Frank mustered, yanking the shovel from the ground. I hear that, Ben replied awkwardly. Frank gave them another crooked grin. Nice meeting you, really. You too, and welcome to the neighborhood, Ben said. Did the last owner look after his lawn a lot? Frank asked as he turned back to his front porch. You know, the usual, I guess, Ben answered. I think I'll take care of it even better than he did, Frank murmured. You've got to watch out for those lumps. But you have to feed the place, right? Oh, the lawn? Yeah, I suppose that's true. Frank turned, wielding the shovel like a spear. Yes, Ben, it is. The sun gleamed off the blade of the shovel. There was a symbol etched into the finely polished steel. It was the outline of a serpent wound up in a tight coil. Somehow that symbol struck some sense of recollection in Angie. That shovel looks familiar. Is it ours or something? Angie asked Ben. Ben squinted in the direction of the shovel, but didn't recall it. I don't know, it's not like ours. This thing? Frank asked, still grinning. He held it out for Angie to examine more closely. Angie did, racking her brain for where she had seen the symbol before. Is it yours? Angie asked. Oh no, Frank replied, stepping inside the house. This was leaning up against the door. Ben dropped the sponge and stepped out of his garage. Where had she seen that shovel before? A single tear ran down his cheek. Oh God, Angie. He's coming back tonight with another. Ben sat by his window watching the cold house across the way. There were no lights in it now. It was silent and black as a dark pit. A slow drizzle refreshed the lawn and street outside, a thin stream of fresh water pouring out of the storm drain and into the side lawn. The house seemed alive to Ben. It seemed to breathe. Only when he really unfocused his eyes could he see the entire frame of the house expand outward like an inflating vacuum bag. The shingled roof looked as if it were sagging gradually before returning to its normal state. The windows above the house garage glinted with faint streaks of light, giving them the illusion of blinking eyes. The outside night was completely empty. Not even a single rabbit squatted in the tall grass. It was only Ben in a living house, and the home knew it. It stared at Ben, its frame rocking and vibrating violently as if it were laughing at him. Fuck you, Ben muttered, nose inches from the frosted glass of his bedroom window. The house stopped breathing altogether and fell silent. Still the rain drizzled, and the street remained unoccupied. Then a Ford truck turned left onto Burberry Lane and advanced toward House 582. Ben instantly dropped to his knees before the window, peeking out of it with his nose placed on the sill. The truck pulled into the driveway of the house, which instantly started to breathe again. The passenger door opened and Frank stepped out. He had changed since the last time Ben saw him. He had lost a lot of weight, his potbelly non-existent. He had grown out a short, bushy beard, and now long, hippie hair covered his shoulders. He had a horseshoe bald patch, and Ben could understand why Frank had shaved his head for all those years. Frank looked around in a short circle, his eyes scanning Ben's very upstairs window. He bundled up his rain slicker and bent down to readjust a rain boot. Frank circled around his truck and reached into its bed. There he fumbled with a large weight. Ben found his opportunity and went for his front door. He patted the gun in his pocket and ensured it was still there as he slowly cracked open his door. Cold wind and rain struck him in the face, forcing him to grimace. He flipped up his hood and dodged outside. He shut his door softly behind him. Ben stuck to the sidewalk, stepping lightly, hand always in his pocket just in case. If Frank caught scent of him and turned, he wanted to be ready. Yet Ben didn't want to fire the weapon. The gun was there for an emergency, in case Frank turned to face Ben with his own firearm. His plan was to sneak up behind Frank and knock him out with the butt of his pistol. Then he would drown him in one of the growing puddles in the road or smash his face in on the pavement. Maybe Ben would even poke both thumbs through the bastard's throat and open his upper body like a bag of chips. Ben grinned at this, his bangs sticking to his forehead like black fingers, rain dripping in and out of his gaping mouth. He crossed the street, quickening his pace as Frank hauled a limp body from the truck. Frank threw the ragdoll figure over his shoulder as if it was nothing. Ben immediately recognized his teenage son, plus a few years. The blonde hair on the kid was even longer, dusting the soaked pavement. Ben saw much of the kid's clothes were soaked in blood, including parts of his scalp. Ben mounted the sidewalk, gun in hand, and let out a soft guttural shriek. The butt of his pistol connected with the bald spot on Frank's skull with a dry crack. Frank grunted, arms going up toward his head. His son slid off his shoulder, head first at Ben's feet. One of the kid's legs knocked Ben across the chest, and he stepped back with surprise. His foot slid off the curb, and he went sprawling backward into a shallow pool of standing water. Frank bent forward over his truck, clutching his bleeding scalp. He spun around to face Ben, eyes bulging like two sick globes. His mouth was pulled into a snarl, teeth gnashing comically. Realization crept over his face as he lumbered toward Ben, and his face fell like a descending curtain. The snarl morphed into a dark grin, showing off his famous crooked teeth. "Why, Benny, here you are," Frank said, his voice smokier than what Ben remembered. "How long has it been? A year?" Ben struggled to his feet, forgetting the pistol that lay by Frank's dead son. "You killed my wife. The day after we met you, she was never the same," Ben spat, stepping once again onto the driveway. "We both know that's not true, Ben," Frank said coldly, blood beginning to creep down his brow. His eyes flashed like the windows of the house, a high-pitched chuckle escaping his locked jaws. "She died long before that day we met. What was it? Cancer? Suicide? Does it even really matter? She made sure I found the shovel that day. It was part of her collection. And who was it that really disappeared that little girl? Was it her? Was it you? I doubt it was the girl's parents. The day after we met, right here in this driveway, she moved in with me, living in my basement, making all kinds of awful noises down there, rearranging and setting up her collection of shovels. Whenever I went down there to see what was going on, the basement was always empty. And I never saw any of her collection, but I could hear them in the night, scraping, clanking. You know how I knew she was dead? My son never saw her that day when you came up to talk to me. Only I saw her. It's because she had chosen me. She wanted me to make one last contribution to the house, my son, but I couldn't do it. I moved out and I thought I was done with her. But no, she came with me. So I'm here, with my son. He's not dead. I knocked him out just like you tried to do to me. I'm here to beg for his life. I'll allow her to take me, if that's what it takes." Ben shook his head furiously. No, you're a liar. Have you never really been inside that house across from yours? Do you know what a haunted house is, Ben? You must. You lived in it with her for who knows how long before she finally disappeared. And she didn't go far. She just walked across the street. I'll tell you what a haunted house is. It's living in the mind of your mad wife. That house is her, all of her sickness, all of her madness. If you don't believe me, open the door. Do what I'm too afraid to do. Ben wound up a fist and let it rocket at Frank's face. There was a crunch as Ben's fist compacted Frank's nose. Warm blood flooded over Ben's fingers, trickling down his arm. Frank screeched, holding his face with trembling hands. Ben then kneed Frank in the stomach, and the breath left Frank's body, rendering him silent. He teetered on his feet, one hand holding his nose, the other his gut. Ben kicked Frank as hard as he could in the side of his face, sending him sideways into the wet grass. Water splashed over his limp body. Ben was about to put a boot into Frank's face when he saw a glint of light off to his right. He turned to see the familiar shovel leaning up against the closed front door. The serpent greeted him on the tip of its blade. It was there for Frank to bury his son, but now it was there for Ben to bury his former neighbor. Ben snatched up the shovel, which radiated an immense heat from its remarkably dry handle. A charge of power flooded over Ben, seizing hold of him. He grinned, clutching the shovel to his chest, the very blade starting to glow with a tremendous orange light. The serpent on the blade began to uncoil and coil again like a stretching spring, a forked tongue poking in and out of its stenciled nose. Frank stirred there in the flooded lawn, muttering gibberish under his breath. Ben stood over him, holding the shovel above his head, meaning to bring it down in one final arc. Frank's eyes focused on Ben, and again he smiled. Now he was missing all his front teeth, and blood covered his face like a scarlet mask. "It never is full. You'll have to do this again," Frank explained weakly. "It's not your first time, and you'll do it again, until you are the next meal. I thank you, for you will set me free." The shovel came down in a bright flash of orange light. When warmth struck Ben's face, he knew it was done. He fell on his knees before his kill, not even realizing he was still calling Angie's name through the mixture of rain, water, and tears. In every corner of her empty basement, Angie kept an upright shovel, leaning up against the wall. Her basement was particularly special because it was the easiest way into her house. There were too many cracks and crevices for the creatures to slip through, which she imagined as the imperfections in a brick. No matter how finely polished the brick was made, there was still a crevice for something to reside, to worm its way in. The spiders always found their way inside her basement easily enough, though they didn't bother her as much. It was the snakes that scared her. No, she had never discovered a snake inside the basement, but in her mind, they slid delicately down the wall in fleshy streamers, coiling in the corners with their backs to the wall and their head poised for attack. Every morning and evening she ventured down into the basement wearing the heaviest clothing imaginable, leather gloves, long underwear, white jacket, and boots up to her knees. She would meticulously tour around every corner, checking to see that her shovels were in place. Why shovels? Not even she could answer that. It seemed the perfect weapon to bash the serpent's head in, watching its paper tongue retract into a head flattened into a scaly pancake with strawberry syrup. Except one of her shovels was missing that day. Her favorite one, the one that was never stained. The moment she realized this, the door to the basement opened, and a figure stood there. A familiar voice called down the steps to her, and she knew that the snake had finally arrived. "Angie," the voice called. "Honey." She did not answer, but her fingers reached blindly for the nearest shovel. As footsteps proceeded down the steps toward her, she crouched in the corner and waited for her chance to strike. Like a snake, she thought to herself. "That grave is mine." Jacob sat down at his usual bench at his usual hour, at sunset, in front of his usual gravestone in the cemetery close to his house. In his usual haunt, in this case in the form of a cemetery, in his predictable vacation mountain town, Jacob crossed his legs and placed his hands in his lap, respectfully addressing the gravestone of a Mrs. Junia Christina, a woman who had been buried so long in this particular boneyard that the moss had long since grown over her inscriptions beneath her name. Judging by the age of the stone, she had been buried there for some time, even though he couldn't confirm a birth or death date, or if she'd been a beloved mother or grandmother. Maybe she had died as a toddler. Jacob could only speculate, but it didn't matter anyway. All that mattered is that her final resting place was situated directly in front of his favorite bench in his favorite graveyard, in his least favorite town in the world. Somehow he knew that out of all the countless hours he'd spent in front of her gravestone, every evening after clocking out of work at his grocery job, that his words had never fallen on deaf ears. There had always been an unmistakable presence leaning on his spoken utterances, as if she was there to share the bench with him, an arm across the back behind him. "Well, Junia, you were right. I should have trusted my gut," Jacob said with a sigh. He tossed the picked wildflowers he'd gathered on his walk to the graveyard at the foot of her stone marker. The hush that followed, where not even the crickets answered, told him she was listening. "It was too soon for us to have joined our bank accounts," he continued. "She took everything." Somewhere a crow cawed, and he couldn't help but think that this was a sign that the world was laughing at him. He guessed that he deserved it. He'd been too trusting of people. He'd never trusted the media, doctors, or the preachers at his parents' church, as all those people wanted him to change his opinions in some way. But he had come to realize in the last few months, jumping into a relationship with a girl he had met at the beach, professing their love, moving in together within a week, and setting a marriage date, that his weakness was not his head or his gut. In fact, both of these pieces of anatomy had screamed at him to slow down and walk the other way. No, it was his heart that failed him every time. You know, my dad told me once that this world is full of good people, Jacob explained. I don't believe that anymore. The Vedics say that this is the Kali Yuga, where over 70% of the people are infested by demons. I know that's true now. People lie to your face, promising you everything, and then justify their misdeeds somehow. I might agree that most people have empathy and love their families, but backed into a corner, they'll turn on their loved ones. Fear is what infects every man and woman I meet, and I'm part of the 30% that are actually real. Maybe you were too, Junior. I like to think we could have been good together. He thought he heard something rustle in the leaves behind him. He turned his head to glance out at the open field behind the cemetery. Sometimes he thought he'd glimpsed orbs of light out there among the trees and tall brush, but he had a difficult time passing them off as fireflies in the night. He also didn't think they were spirits, even though he was in a graveyard. No, he didn't believe in ghosts, not like most people did. In fact, he believed he was a ghost, as the world that had ensnared him was most definitely hell. The demons that surrounded him were positive enough proof for him, let alone the food designed to make him sick, the entertainment pushing ultra-violence and gratuitous sex, and the media that lied to its audiences in the guise of national security. But there was nothing behind him. There were no lights or tourists cutting through the woods. It was past Columbus Day, and that meant all the vacationers had gone home. Every year his mountain lakefront town faced a severe lull, which was almost mind-numbing. 7 months out of the year, his main street was a revolving door where endless floods of people pushed their way inside for a kiss of sun and a touch of lake water as warm as a bath. But now it was strange to see the streets and shops so empty, like a rapture had struck, and he was left behind to suffer in his ghost town, his own private hell forever. He thought it was all fitting in light of his new mindset. The town might as well feel as dead as he now did. Junior, you're the lucky one. Wherever you are, you're free from this. At least I hope. Maybe we're destined to live our lives over and over again. I don't know. If that's the case, then you're still in this hell with me, somewhere. He blew a kiss at her gravestone and stood up to leave. This time he did catch a movement of light in the corner of his eye and turned to look. It was like looking through a foggy mirror. Everything seemed to be under murky water, and he even pushed his hands through what he thought might be an actual see-through veil, but his fingers only touched air. Passing it off as a trick of light in the falling dusk, he moved on, down the deserted main street and back into his home where he hoped to smother his sorrows with deep, dreamless sleep. Halloween was quickly approaching, and when he couldn't sleep, he looked out his window at the still streets and alleyways. Something compelled him to turn on the TV to occupy his mind and perhaps distract his thoughts for long enough to plunge him into oblivion. Sitting there in his reclining chair, he turned on the local news and watched as a young weather girl, cute, blonde, and trim, gave the evening's forecast. Then he was sitting stock straight in his chair when he read the name that labeled her at the bottom of the screen, Junia Christina. But it wasn't even what she said that suddenly caused his chest to begin pounding with new surges of blood, pushing past the limits of his maximum capacity, to the point where he thought he might get what he wished for anyway and pass out right there in front of the screen. "And is it true you have a birthday coming up, Junia?" one of the anchors asked with a mocking kind of sing-song tone. She smiled with hands on hips. "Oh, the secret's out then, is it?" The camera switched back to the anchor, pressed and prime in his suit and manicured haircut. "It's not that I just disclosed your age or anything," he replied with a dry, actor's grin. "That's no secret," she admitted. "Everyone in town knows I'm a millennium baby. I accidentally outed myself on live air last New Year's." They passed it off with more dull banter that quickly slam-cut to the waiting commercial break. Jacob was already out of his chair and staring out the window again, but now it was too dark to see any of the emptiness. Even the streetlights did little to penetrate the thickening shadows. There was no hope for him to get any sleep that night, he had already decided. The only thing that would settle his reeling mind would be one last meeting with the woman named Junia Christina, not the lady on the TV, but the corpse buried and almost forgotten at his local cemetery. It wasn't a common name, not there in the States. He'd even researched it once to see it was much more common in Scotland or any of the UK territories. What were the odds, really? He intended to find out. More than anything, he just needed to know. He wasn't sure if the answer would really settle his anxiety or intensify it. He stepped outside and didn't think twice walking down the middle of the road, certain that it would be his all the way to the cemetery, and it was. He didn't even run into a squirrel tearing through the trees. He had never been to the cemetery that late at night, and he hadn't accounted for the sheer lack of lamplight or the frigidness of the air, which wasn't kind to his bare arms and legs. He had never been frightened to be there before, and it wasn't the late night hours or the strange cast of bluish light that seemed to emanate from the moon in the sky. He had the feeling of being watched, similar to the presence he felt when talking to Junia, but nothing like this prickling sensation where hundreds of thoughts were now dedicated to him, as if he was giving a public speech in front of a stadium of people, all their hooks into him now. He had much difficulty finding Junia's gravestone in the dark, and he had to use the flashlight from his phone to clear the ivy from the marble in order to read the inscription. There it was, born 2000, died 2078. He checked the next gravestone, and the next. The latest date he found was 3003, and as soon as he saw that, he was reeling away from the square of freshest graves, tripping over the raised mounds in the grass, and gravitating naturally toward the open field, the darkest void yet. The space was so black that he had to stop and backtrack, setting his sights for the nearest streetlight on the corner. He heard more rustling behind him, but he resisted the urge to look. Certain that the graveyard was somehow a slip in time, a portal into the future, he began to pray for his safe transport back to 2023, back into the hell that he belonged to, not in this other realm that had swallowed the bodies of every man, woman, and child currently alive and asleep in their beds. He reached the main street and stood there under the buzzing streetlight, content with the October date displayed on his phone, and with the biting wind that seemed to pierce his very skin and chill his bones. Then he saw it. The same firefly-like orbs that he'd caught sight of in the field directly behind him, but now dancing down the street toward him. He found that he couldn't move, not while those lights hypnotized him, up and down, side to side, with the beginnings of a casual stride, left foot, right foot. And now the silhouettes of people were beginning to form, transparent and bluish bright in the moon's glow, and he started to see shoulders, heads, swinging arms. There were dozens of them, mostly featureless, but clear men and women, and even children, all dressed as if going to a funeral in their Sunday best. He retreated into the shadows, ducked down low in the ditch, but they weren't coming his way. They turned left into the graveyard, and he followed them with his eyes, approaching the waist-high wrought iron fence between him and them. He expected the specters to proceed past the graves and into the impenetrable shadows of the field, the only place he'd ever seen them before. But they began to fan out from the single-file line and break off into small clusters, and then into lonely single orbs of light. Each one found their respective gravestone and disappeared into the ground. He even saw Junia, the cute weather girl from the TV, but now a hologram of who she used to be, but unmistakably her. She strode slow and deliberately, passing through several gravestones along the way and staring fixedly ahead of her. She did not stagger or shift her pace at all, stepping over the dips in the ground and walking on the air itself. Jacob hopped over the fence and skirted the outer exterior of the cemetery, matching her pace and maneuvering blindly, but certain of her destination. She passed through his favorite bench without flinching and sank into the recently cut grass covering her plot. He watched the top of her head disappear into the dirt. He was about to run again, but he became aware of more blinking lights, this time in the field, and as his eyes focused, he saw that they were people, luminescent like the other ghosts, but more solid. And unlike the brigade of souls parading down the main street, they noticed him, and they were even motioning for him to come closer. They were nicely dressed like the others, but there were so many more of them, and they had more defined features on their faces. Some of them were smiling, others looked concerned. Some were the epitome of youth, others glowed with a warm wisdom and kind age that instantly caused Jacob to relax his guard. They wanted him to come closer, but they didn't move to approach him. He could see the veil shimmering again, like that window glass, separating the graveyard from the clearing beyond. He was certain that they couldn't walk through.
And when he had that thought, they were motioning more dramatically now, their mouths moving without sound. It seemed that they thought he could make it through, but he felt rooted to the spot suddenly. A light filled his peripherals again, and he turned to watch an exact double of himself, in a full tuxedo, pass within arm's length and proceed to the end of the nearest set of plots, at the stone marker at the very end, and he knew that the grave was his. "Hey!" he screamed, without knowing what else to say, and the night erupted with the sudden invasion of sound. The spectre sharing his image froze and turned slowly around. His features were blurred and unpronounced, but Jacob could tell that he was petrified to meet eyes with his exact double. His eyes widened and his aura of light dimmed. "You?" a shaky voice responded, seemingly from every direction at once, and Jacob recognized it as his own. "This is hell," Jacob screamed, speaking with more confidence than he'd ever mustered before. "Don't go that way. Turn around." He watched the image fade into nothing before his eyes, and he sprinted through the spot his double once stood to inspect the gravestone with a shaking flashlight beam. There he read, "Jacob Lowry, born March 1984, died December 2023. He dropped his phone between his feet and put the cemetery at his 6 o'clock, focusing once again on the field. It was no longer black, but midday on the other side of the glassy screen, and the people were not watching him anymore, but dancing with each other, chasing dogs, picnicking, and playing tag with children. He so wanted to push past the barrier separating this paradise from his sunless scene. But the mystery of his grave inscription had already taken root in his mind. His gut and his heart understood this time, but his head was now crippled by the mystery, and he fell on his hands and knees in front of his final resting place, grappling with his phone and searching the obituaries online for his own name. But he couldn't find it, and the date on his calendar told him it was 2023, but still October. He still had time. There was still so much for him to do, or to undo, there in hell. There was nowhere else he belonged, there in the prison cell of that town that he hated so much, and all the rest of the pitiful tourists and lost souls haunting the ugly streets. And he decided he would not miss the next midnight parade down Main Street.